I'm going to tell you the story of one of the greatest deceptions in modern crime history. It is the story of a man who fooled judges, journalists, artists, and even entire nations into believing that he had transformed from a violent killer into a redeemed poet. He was invited into schools to lecture children about morality. He was interviewed on television as a model of rehabilitation, and he mingled with intellectuals who admired his talent. But behind this carefully constructed mask, he was still killing, still stalking, still strangling women with cold precision. His name was Jack Unterweger, and his life remains one of the most haunting lessons about trust, manipulation, and evil hidden in plain sight. Jack Unterweger was born on August 16, 1950, in the small Austrian town of Judenburg. His childhood was marked from the very beginning by instability and neglect. His mother was a young barmaid, often described as irresponsible and unstable, who had a fleeting relationship with an American soldier stationed in post-war Europe. That soldier disappeared before Jack was even born, leaving the boy fatherless. His mother's lifestyle made her incapable of providing stability, and Jack spent much of his youth moving between relatives, foster homes, and the streets. The boy grew up in poverty and isolation. He was teased for his background, seen as an outcast, and from a very young age he developed a sense of resentment toward society. By the time he was in his early teens, he had already begun committing petty crimes, theft, and assault. He showed little regard for rules or authority. More disturbingly, he displayed cruelty toward others, particularly women. Teachers and relatives noticed his lies, his charm, and his strange ability to manipulate those around him. These traits would only grow stronger as he matured. As a young man, Unterweger drifted through life without steady work. He lived as a small-time criminal, committing robberies and burglaries, spending time in and out of jail. But by the mid-1970s, his violence escalated. In 1974, he committed his first known murder. His victim was an 18-year-old German woman named Margaret Schaefer. He picked her up, assaulted her, and then strangled her to death using her own bra. The act was brutal and deeply symbolic. The very object of femininity was turned into an instrument of death. The method revealed the psychological signature that would define his killings for decades. He was arrested soon after and sentenced to life in prison. Most people would have expected him to fade into obscurity behind bars. But Jack Unterweger was not ordinary. In prison, he began to reinvent himself. He discovered writing. He started with poetry, short stories, and eventually wrote an autobiography. His work was raw, confessional, and dark, filled with reflections on crime, suffering, and the human condition. To some, it sounded authentic. Intellectuals, journalists, and artists began to take notice of him. By the 1980s, Unterweger was a minor celebrity in Austrian literary circles. He was praised as a man who had turned his life around through art. Supporters argued that he was living proof that rehabilitation was possible. Public figures, including well-known writers and even politicians, campaigned for his release. They described him as a sensitive man who had confronted his demons. The prison system was pressured, and eventually, after serving only 15 years of his life sentence, Jack Unterweger was released in 1990. His freedom was greeted almost like the debut of a cultural star. He appeared on television talk shows, gave radio interviews, and was invited to schools to speak about the dangers of crime. Newspapers published his articles, and he was even asked to cover stories about crime and prostitution. He presented himself as a moral commentator, a man who had once sinned but now stood as a warning for others. Austria embraced him, but within months of his release, sex workers began to disappear. Their bodies were found strangled with their own bras, just like the murder in 1974. The pattern was chillingly familiar. Over the next 2 years, a wave of killings spread across Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Germany. Unterweger traveled frequently under the pretense of research and writing. In reality, he was hunting. In a grotesque twist, he even traveled to Los Angeles as a visiting journalist in 1991. There, while supposedly researching a story about prostitution, 3 women were murdered in exactly the same manner. The bra ligature was unmistakable. He wrote articles condemning the conditions of sex workers, even as he killed them. It was a double life so audacious that it shocked investigators when the truth came out. By 1992, suspicions became impossible to ignore. Austrian police matched his movements with the locations of the murders. Fibers from his clothing were linked to victims. Witnesses placed him near crime scenes. The facade began to crumble. But when authorities moved to arrest him, Unterweger fled with a girlfriend, crossing borders and evading capture. For months, he was on the run, until finally, in February 1992, he was arrested in Miami, Florida. His trial in Austria in 1994 was one of the most publicized in the country's history. The courtroom was packed, cameras rolled, and the once celebrated writer now stood exposed as a predator. The evidence was overwhelming. He was charged with 11 murders across Austria, Germany, and the United States. The jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to life without parole. But Jack Unterweger was not willing to live out another prison term. On June 29, 1994, the very night he was sentenced, he tied the drawstring of his prison tracksuit around his neck and hanged himself in his cell. It was a final act of control, one last deception, denying the world the spectacle of watching him age behind bars. The method of his suicide echoed his crimes, once again using a ligature to end life. The story of Jack Unterweger remains one of the most disturbing cautionary tales in modern history. It revealed how charisma and talent can blind even the most educated people, how the hunger for redemption stories can lead society to ignore warning signs, and how evil can thrive beneath the mask of art and intellect. His victims, many of them women on the margins of society, were overshadowed during his lifetime by the fascination with the killer himself. Today, their names are remembered as the true tragedy at the heart of his story. Jack Unterweger's life is a lesson in deception. He was not reformed. He was not healed. He was a manipulator, a predator, and a killer who used culture itself as a shield. His story reminds us that words can charm, but actions never lie. Next story. I'm going to tell you a story about a woman whose fear of death became a force of horror. Every parent fears losing their children, but Leonarda Cianciulli's fear consumed her to the point of madness. She believed that death was always watching, always waiting to take her family, and she would stop at nothing to protect them. Her solution was unthinkable. She murdered innocent women, dismembered them, and turned their bodies into soap and cakes, which she then used or distributed, believing these acts would shield her children from fate. This is the story of Leonarda Cianciulli, the soap maker of Correggio, a woman whose obsession transformed ordinary life into a nightmare for everyone she touched. Leonarda was born in 1894 in Montella, a small town in southern Italy, one of 13 children, though only a few survived infancy. Her early life was dominated by grief and death. Her mother died when Leonarda was still a child, and her father was distant, strict, and often harsh. She grew up in a household where superstition was part of daily life and where the threat of misfortune seemed ever present. She witnessed death as a constant companion, and this awareness shaped the way she viewed the world. Survival, safety, and the avoidance of death became central to her thinking. As she grew older, Leonarda became increasingly superstitious and obsessed with the occult. She studied tarot cards, astrology, fortune-telling, and mystical rituals. She believed she could interpret fate, foresee misfortune, and influence events through ritual. These beliefs gave her a sense of control over a world she perceived as chaotic and dangerous. Her obsession with death deepened when she married Michel Cianciulli in 1917 and had children. Though she hoped family life would bring stability, tragedy continued to follow her. One of her children died, and the fear of losing the remaining children became all-consuming. By the 1930s, Leonarda's fear of death had become a compulsion with fatal consequences. She was convinced that in order to protect her family, she needed to perform rituals involving human sacrifice. She believed that by killing women and using their bodies in specific ways, she could transfer their life force to herself and her family. shielding them from harm. Her first known victim was Faustina Seti, a woman who had come to Leonarda's home seeking spiritual guidance. Leonarda invited her in, drugged her, and murdered her. She then dismembered the body, boiling some parts in a soap and baking others into cakes. She believed consuming or distributing these products would protect her children. Over the next several years, Leonarda continued her ritual murders, carefully selecting vulnerable women who would trust her. She lured them with promises of fortune-telling, employment, or friendship. Once inside her home, she killed them, dismembered their bodies, and converted their remains into soap, cakes, and other household products. She sometimes gave these items to neighbors or friends, completely unaware of what they were consuming. Her calm and friendly exterior concealed the meticulous planning and brutal violence that occurred within her walls. Leonarda's murders were methodical and ritualistic. She carefully planned each abduction, ensured privacy during the killings, and cleaned up afterward to avoid suspicion. Her belief that these acts would protect her children justified, in her mind, every detail. She kept no formal records, but witnesses and later investigators pieced together the extent of her crimes. The number of victims remains uncertain, but the brutality and calculation behind each murder are undeniable. The discovery of her crimes came in 1940, when neighbors reported strange odors and suspicious activity coming from her home. Police investigation uncovered human remains, tools used to dismember bodies, and evidence of her ritual practices. The scope of her crimes shocked Italy. Multiple victims were identified, and the horrifying details of how she processed their bodies became public knowledge. The nation was horrified that a seemingly ordinary, devoted mother could commit such atrocities. Leonarda's trial in 1946 was one of the most notorious in modern Italian history. She explained that she had been guided by mystical forces and that her murders were necessary to protect her family. Psychologists testified that she suffered from extreme superstition, obsessive-compulsive tendencies, and delusions regarding death and protection. The court sentenced her to 30 years in prison and committed her to a psychiatric facility, where she remained until her death in 1970. Throughout her imprisonment, she maintained that her actions were justified, believing she had saved her children from harm. Her story is a chilling study of how fear, superstition, and obsession can destroy morality and empathy. Leonarda Cianciulli's life demonstrates that even ordinary individuals, consumed by irrational fears, can commit extraordinary acts of cruelty. The victims she murdered remain silent, but their lives and the horror of their deaths continue to haunt history. Her name is remembered not only for the grotesque methods she used, but for the terrifying insight into how fear can twist human behavior into something monstrous. Leonarda Cianciulli's story is more than a tale of murder. It is a warning of the darkness that fear can create, of how obsession with protection and survival can push ordinary people to unimaginable extremes, and of the horrors that can hide behind calm, ordinary appearances. Every ritual, every murder, every piece of soap and cake she created was a testament to a mind that had surrendered entirely to terror, leaving only cruelty behind. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of a man who made ordinary streets feel unsafe, whose quiet life concealed unimaginable horror. Children disappeared in broad daylight. Parents lived in constant fear. Behind the closed doors of his small apartment in Tokyo, he committed acts of cruelty so extreme that they shook an entire nation to its core. This man was Tsutomu Miyazaki, later called the Otaku Murderer, a name that still sends chills through anyone who hears it. Tsutomu Miyazaki was born in 1962 in Japan, the youngest of 4 children in a family that seemed normal on the surface but was strained beneath. His father was a government worker, his mother a homemaker. From a very young age, Miyazaki was shy, withdrawn, and deeply isolated. He struggled to communicate with other children and became increasingly obsessed with books, horror media, and later, anime. While other children played in parks or schoolyards, he spent hours alone, immersing himself in fantastical worlds that gave him comfort but also fueled his growing detachment from reality. By his teenage years, Miyazaki's behavior had become alarming. He was socially awkward to the point of being almost invisible in public, yet in private, he developed obsessive tendencies. He collected disturbing materials, ranging from violent pornography to horror magazines, and created a world in which violence and death became familiar companions. Teachers and relatives noticed his oddities, but he was never physically violent during these years. Instead, his obsession with control, isolation, and the macabre quietly took root. After finishing school, Miyazaki lived alone in small apartments in Tokyo. His family relationships were distant and strained. He did not work steadily, and he rarely socialized. He developed compulsive routines, spending hours in libraries and stores collecting books and media about death, mutilation, and human anatomy. His obsessions were not just hobbies. They became a lens through which he viewed the world. He began to fantasize about controlling life and death, and these fantasies grew darker with each year. In the late 1980s, Miyazaki's obsession with death transformed into action. Between 1988 and 1989, he abducted and murdered at least 4 young girls, ages ranging from 4 to 7, in Tokyo. His method was both premeditated and meticulous. He would approach girls in parks or near their homes, often under the pretense of offering candy or gifts. He targeted the most vulnerable, those least likely to be missed immediately. Once he had them in his apartment, he subjected them to horrifying acts of sexual assault, physical torture, and ultimately murder. Miyazaki documented his crimes extensively. He kept photographs, drawings, and journals detailing every action. These records revealed a man who derived a deep sense of control and pleasure from the suffering of others. He planned his murders carefully, cleaning and organizing his apartment between attacks, and disposing of evidence in a way that initially made detection difficult. Despite his meticulous nature, the horror of his acts eventually left a trail that investigators could follow. The investigation was slow and painstaking. At first, police treated each disappearance separately, but a pattern began to emerge. Witnesses reported seeing a strange, thin man lurking near playgrounds and public areas where young girls played. Families of missing children became desperate, and newspapers began reporting on the possibility of a serial killer in Tokyo. Miyazaki, however, continued his murders, each time exploiting gaps in law enforcement and the trust of the community. In 1989, authorities finally gathered enough evidence to arrest him. The discovery of his photographs, journals, and other incriminating items left no doubt about his guilt. During interrogation, Miyazaki initially denied the charges, but eventually confessed to the murders in chilling detail. He described his crimes calmly, speaking of each abduction, each act of torture, and each victim as if recounting a story rather than acknowledging the humanity of the children he had killed. His demeanor shocked investigators, demonstrating his complete lack of empathy and emotional detachment. The trial of Tsutomu Miyazaki became one of the most infamous in Japanese history. Psychologists testified about his mental state, highlighting traits consistent with psychopathy, sexual sadism, and severe obsessive-compulsive behavior. The public was horrified, and the media labeled him the otaku murderer, linking his obsession with manga, anime, and horror media to his crimes. Though experts emphasize that media alone does not create killers, the moniker captured the public imagination, symbolizing a man who lived entirely in fantasy while committing unspeakable violence in reality. In 1997, after years of investigation, trial, and appeals, Miyazaki was sentenced to death. The court cited the extreme cruelty of his acts, the young age of his victims, and his total lack of remorse. He remained on death row for over a decade, a period during which psychologists continued to study his case, hoping to understand the roots of his pathology. On June 17, 2008, Tsutomu Miyazaki was executed by hanging. The aftermath of his crimes left a deep impact on Japanese society. Parents restricted their children's movements, schools implemented stricter safety measures, and law enforcement increased monitoring of individuals with violent obsessions. Miyazaki's case also fueled academic studies into the link between social isolation, obsessive behavior, and extreme psychopathy. His life remains a case study of how a deeply disturbed mind can hide in plain sight, exploiting social systems and the innocence of children. Tsutomu Miyazaki's story is a chilling reminder that evil can be quiet, polite, and unassuming. He was a man whose outward appearance was unremarkable, whose daily routine seemed mundane, yet who held in his private life a darkness so profound that it terrorized an entire city. The names of his victims live on, a haunting testament to the lives stolen by the otaku murderer, and a warning of the horrors that can lurk behind ordinary doors. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of a woman who made death part of her daily life. Behind the high walls of her castle, the cries of young girls echoed in the dark. They were lured inside with promises of work and safety, but they were beaten, tortured, and left to die in ways too cruel to imagine. It is said that hundreds never came out alive. Her name was Elizabeth Bathory, and history remembers her as the Blood Countess. Elizabeth Bathory was born in 1560 in the Kingdom of Hungary. From the moment she entered the world, she carried the weight of privilege and power. She belonged to one of the richest and most influential families in Europe. Her bloodline tied her to princes, cardinals, and rulers. As a child, she lived in castles, surrounded by servants and luxury. But her childhood was not filled with kindness. Life in the 16th century was brutal, and Elizabeth was exposed to that brutality early. She grew up seeing peasants punished in public squares. Criminals were whipped, branded, or mutilated. Executions were not hidden, but celebrated as a show of order and control. Servants in her household were treated as objects, beaten without mercy for mistakes. Elizabeth absorbed this environment. To her, pain became normal, cruelty became expected, and human suffering became a tool to enforce power. Unlike many women of her time, Elizabeth was highly educated. She learned to read and write in several languages, including Latin, German, and Hungarian. She studied mathematics, law, and science. Her intelligence made her stand out, but it also sharpened her sense of superiority. She began to see herself as not just noble by birth, but naturally above those around her. This mixture of intelligence, pride, and exposure to violence created the foundation for something monstrous. At the age of 15, Elizabeth married Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a man feared for his cruelty on the battlefield. Their wedding united two powerful dynasties and secured Elizabeth even greater influence. She moved into her husband's castle and soon found herself in charge of vast estates. Ferenc was often away fighting wars, leaving Elizabeth to rule alone. She held authority over hundreds of servants and peasants. Whispers began almost immediately. Servants spoke of her rage, of beatings that left bruises and broken bones. A maid who made a mistake in her chores could be whipped until she bled. A disobedient girl could be locked away without food. Elizabeth's power over life and death was absolute, and she wielded it without hesitation. When her husband died in 1604, Elizabeth was 44 years old, wealthy, and fully independent. No longer restrained by marriage, her cruelty deepened. It was in these years that her crimes reached their darkest level. With the help of a small circle of trusted servants, she began to lure young peasant girls into her castles. Families were told their daughters would find work as maids. Others were simply taken under false promises. Once inside, the girls became prisoners. Witness testimony later described acts of shocking violence. Girls were struck with clubs until their bones shattered. They were cut with knives and scissors. Needles were pushed under their fingernails. They were burned with hot irons or doused in freezing water and left outside in the snow until they froze to death. Some were starved until they wasted away. It was said Elizabeth herself took part in the torment, striking them, biting their flesh, and laughing at their screams. The most infamous legend claimed that Elizabeth bathed in the blood of virgins, believing it would preserve her youth and beauty. Whether or not this was true, the core fact remained. Young women were dying in shocking numbers. Servants spoke of bodies hidden in the castle cellars, buried in shallow graves, or burned in secret to hide the evidence. The number of victims grew so large that it could no longer be concealed. By 1609, priests began to complain about the suspicious frequency of burials of young women connected to her household. Local peasants whispered that their daughters had gone to the castle and never returned. The rumors spread wider, reaching the ears of the king himself. In 1610, King Matthias II ordered an investigation. A team of soldiers raided Elizabeth's castle. What they found shocked even hardened men. Some girls were found dead. Others were barely alive, their bodies covered in wounds, starved and broken. The chambers of the castle bore the marks of torture. Elizabeth was immediately placed under house arrest, and her servants were dragged away for questioning. Under interrogation, her servants confessed. They described in detail the horrors they had witnessed and participated in. They told of Elizabeth beating girls until they collapsed, of needles pushed into their skin, of girls burned with irons, and of corpses stacked in secret. The number of victims they spoke of was staggering. Some claimed dozens, others spoke of hundreds. One figure reached more than 600 girls. Historians doubt the highest number, but even the lowest estimates made Elizabeth one of the most prolific killers in history. Her servants were put on trial and executed for their role in the crimes. Elizabeth, however, was too powerful and too noble to be publicly tried or executed. Instead, in 1611, she was sentenced to permanent confinement within her own castle. The windows of her chamber were bricked up, leaving only a small slit through which food could be passed. She lived in darkness and isolation, cut off from the world. For 4 years, she remained like this. In 1614, guards found her lying dead on the floor of her chamber. She was 54 years old. She was buried in her family crypt, but so much fear and hatred surrounded her name that her body was later removed, and its final resting place remains uncertain. The story of Elizabeth Bathory spread quickly across Europe. Some saw her as a monster, a woman consumed by vanity and sadism. Others believed the scale of her crimes had been exaggerated by men who envied her power and wanted her destroyed. Modern historians continue to debate the exact truth. Was she a sadistic serial killer who murdered hundreds? Or was she a victim of political conspiracy? The truth lies somewhere between legend and fact. But the evidence of dead girls, of testimony under oath, and of bodies discovered in her castle cannot be denied. Over 4 centuries later, Elizabeth Bathory is remembered as one of the most infamous women in history. Her name is tied to vampire myths, to stories of blood and eternal youth. But behind the legends lies the reality of countless young women who suffered and died under her power. Their voices were silenced by nobility, but their story lives on in the shadow of her name. This was the life and crimes of Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess, a noble woman who turned castles into prisons, whose cruelty became legend, and whose darkness still chills the world to this day. Next story, I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in history. It is the story of Luis Alfredo Garavito, a man from Colombia whose crimes against children in the 1990s shocked the entire world. His acts of violence were so widespread and so brutal that he is remembered as one of the most prolific killers in recorded history. What makes his story especially haunting is not only the scale of his crimes, but also the way he lived for years undetected, leaving entire communities devastated and fearful. Luis Alfredo Garavito was born in 1957 in a small town in Colombia. His early childhood was marked by abuse, neglect, and hardship. He grew up in a large family where poverty was a daily struggle, and his father was violent toward both him and his siblings. From an early age, Garavito experienced physical abuse, emotional neglect, and exposure to alcoholism. These experiences shaped his psychology in deep and lasting ways. He grew up feeling powerless, angry, and alienated, and these feelings would later become twisted into desires for control and domination over the most vulnerable victims. As a young man, Garavito developed a troubled personality. He was socially awkward, prone to bursts of anger, and unable to maintain stable relationships. He drifted between jobs, often working as a street vendor or laborer. He developed alcoholism, which worsened his instability. Behind his outward struggles, however, he was developing an obsession with children. His earliest assaults were attempts to gain power and control, driven by a combination of anger, desire, and psychological disturbance. Over time, these assaults escalated into a horrifying pattern of murder. Garavito's method was both calculated and deceptive. He targeted young boys, often from poor families or those living on the streets. Many of his victims were between the ages of 6 and 16. He would approach them with offers of food, money, or work, sometimes pretending to be a charitable man who wanted to help. Once he gained their trust, he would lure them to secluded areas such as fields, abandoned buildings, or hidden roadsides. There he would bind, assault, torture, and kill them, often using knives or other sharp objects. His crimes were marked by extreme cruelty, reflecting not only his desire to dominate, but also deep-seated sadistic impulses. What made Garavito particularly dangerous was his ability to move frequently and adapt his methods. Colombia in the 1990s was experiencing widespread social turmoil, poverty, and armed conflict. Thousands of children were living on the streets, making them easy prey. Many of the families were too poor to pursue investigations, and authorities were often overwhelmed with other crises. This environment allowed Garavito to operate for years without drawing major attention. By the mid-1990s, reports of missing boys were rising dramatically. Communities began to notice patterns. Bodies of children were found in clusters, often in rural areas. Many showed signs of torture and mutilation. The level of violence was shocking, and fear began to spread as families realized a predator was targeting their children. Still, it took years for authorities to connect the cases and identify Garavito as the suspect. The breakthrough came in 1999 when police discovered a mass grave containing the remains of multiple children. Evidence collected at the site, including clothing and personal items, led investigators to track Garavito's movements. Around the same time, a boy who had survived one of his attacks provided descriptions that matched him. Police began to close in, and Garavito was eventually arrested. During interrogation, Garavito confessed in chilling detail. He admitted to murdering 140 children and suggested the number might be even higher. Later investigations linked him to over 170 victims, though some estimates placed the true figure at more than 200. His calm and matter-of-fact descriptions of the crimes horrified investigators. He explained how he chose his victims, how he gained their trust, and how he killed them. He showed no real remorse, only a detached recounting of events as if he were describing a routine. Garavito's trial was one of the most significant in Colombian history. The scale of his crimes was unprecedented. Families of victims filled the courtroom, demanding justice and answers. Psychologists testified about his severe antisocial personality disorder, his sadistic impulses, and his compulsive behavior. He was described as a predator driven by uncontrollable urges, but also as a calculating manipulator who carefully planned his actions. In 1999, Garavito was sentenced to 1,853 years in prison, the longest sentence ever given in Colombia at the time. However, under Colombian law, the maximum time an individual can serve is 40 years. This caused outrage among the public, as many felt it was not sufficient punishment for the scale of his crimes. Authorities later adjusted the maximum to 60 years for special cases, but it still meant that Garavito could not technically serve the full length of his sentence. While in prison, Garavito occasionally cooperated with investigators, helping them locate burial sites of his victims. Even so, his behavior in prison reflected the same manipulative personality he had always shown. He sometimes portrayed himself as repentant, asking for forgiveness, while at other times he remained cold and detached. Families of victims struggled with the knowledge that the man responsible for so much pain would never face the full measure of justice. Garavito's crimes had a lasting impact on Colombia. They highlighted the vulnerabilities of street children and the failures of institutions meant to protect them. His actions forced reforms in how authorities track missing children, investigate serial crimes, and provide resources for poor families. Nonprofit organizations and child protection groups grew stronger in the aftermath, determined to prevent another tragedy on such a scale. Psychologists studying Garavito's case have described him as one of the most extreme examples of sadistic serial killers. His lack of empathy, his ability to deceive, and his willingness to kill repeatedly made him extraordinarily dangerous. The fact that he targeted children, the most vulnerable members of society, made his crimes especially horrifying. He remains one of the most studied cases in criminal psychology, both for the sheer number of victims and the systematic way in which he carried out his murders. Luis Alfredo Garavito died in 2023 while still in prison, reportedly from natural causes. His death brought a measure of closure, though for many families it was too late. The memory of the children he killed continues to haunt Colombia, and his story remains a warning about the depths of human cruelty and the need for vigilance in protecting the vulnerable. The story of Garavito is not just about one man's crimes. It is also about the social and economic conditions that made those crimes possible. Poverty, neglect, and weak institutions allowed him to thrive for years. His actions forced Colombia to confront those weaknesses, and though progress has been made, the pain of his victims' families remains a permanent scar. Today, Garavito is remembered as one of the worst killers in history. His crimes stand as a reminder of what can happen when society fails to protect its children. The lessons from his case continue to inform criminal justice systems around the world, ensuring that the suffering he caused is never forgotten. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in history. It is the story of Marc Dutroux, a man whose actions in Belgium during the 1980s and 1990s revealed not only the extent of his cruelty, but also exposed failures in the country's police and justice systems. His crimes shocked an entire nation, and his name remains one of the most infamous in Europe's criminal history. Marc Dutroux was born in Brussels in 1956. He was the eldest of 5 children in a family marked by instability and neglect. His parents were both teachers, but they were harsh, distant, and unable to provide warmth. At home, arguments were frequent and emotional care was lacking. By the time Dutroux reached adolescence, his parents divorced, and he spent much of his teenage years drifting between relatives and institutions. The lack of structure and affection played a key role in shaping his personality. Teachers described him as intelligent but manipulative. He often lied, stole, and tried to bend situations to his advantage. During his teenage years, Dutroux began to show disturbing tendencies. He was fascinated by control and domination. He frequently stole from classmates and bullied weaker peers. By the age of 18, he had already been arrested several times for theft and auto crimes. These early brushes with the law did little to deter him, and he quickly gained a reputation as a cunning but untrustworthy young man. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Dutroux's crimes escalated. He began abducting and assaulting young girls, using manipulation and physical force to gain control. In 1986, he was arrested and convicted of kidnapping and assaulting 5 girls. He was sentenced to 13 years in prison. At the time, psychiatrists who evaluated him described him as manipulative, narcissistic, and dangerous, with a high risk of reoffending. Despite this, Dutroux served only 3 years before being released on parole in 1989. This decision would later haunt Belgium, as it allowed him to continue his predatory activities. Upon his release, Dutroux carefully constructed a double life. To the outside world, he appeared to be a tradesman, working as an electrician and handyman. He lived in a modest home with his wife, Michelle Martin, whom he had married in 1983. They had children together, and to neighbors he seemed like an eccentric but ordinary man. In reality, however, Dutroux was building a network of properties across Belgium, many of which contained secret chambers. In one of his most disturbing acts of preparation, Dutrix built underground cells in the basements of his homes. These chambers were hidden behind false walls and secured with heavy locks. They were small, dark, and designed to hold young girls captive. He stocked them with food, water, and mattresses. His planning showed methodical premeditation and a chilling level of organization. Throughout the early 1990s, Dutrix resumed his cycle of abduction. His method was simple but effective. He would drive around areas where children walked home from school or gather with friends, and he would lure or force them into his vehicle. Once in his control, they were taken to the hidden chambers and held in captivity. There, they endured prolonged suffering, including assault and psychological torment. Dutrix was not acting entirely alone. His wife, Michelle Martin, played a crucial role in his crimes. She sometimes lured victims by pretending to offer them help. She also fed and monitored the imprisoned girls while Dutrix was away. Other accomplices assisted in various ways, though none were as central as Martin. This collaboration made his crimes even more horrifying, as they showed a shared willingness to inflict suffering on vulnerable children. Some of the girls Dutrix captured did not survive their ordeal. Investigators later discovered that 2 victims left unattended while Dutrix was briefly imprisoned on another offense, died of starvation in his basement. Michelle Martin, though aware of their presence, failed to intervene or provide food. These deaths highlighted not only Dutrix's cruelty, but also Martin's complicity. The scale of Dutrix's crimes might never have been fully uncovered if not for a series of investigative breakthroughs in 1996. After reports of another attempted abduction, police linked Dutrix to the crime. When his properties were searched, investigators made a chilling discovery. Behind false walls and beneath floors, they found hidden chambers where children had been held captive. Some victims were rescued alive, while the remains of others were unearthed. Authorities also recovered videotapes Dutrix had made, documenting his crimes and confirming the extent of his actions. The revelations shocked Belgium to its core. The public was horrified not only by the brutality of the crimes, but also by how many opportunities had been missed to stop Dutrix earlier. Neighbors had reported suspicious activity, including sounds of children crying, but searches of his home had been careless. In one instance, police officers stood just feet above where 2 girls were imprisoned but failed to discover the hidden compartment. As news spread, Belgium erupted in anger. The people demanded accountability, not only for the crimes, but for the repeated failures of the justice system. In October 1996, hundreds of thousands of Belgians took to the streets in what became known as the White March. Citizens dressed in white and carried white balloons as symbols of innocence lost. It was one of the largest public demonstrations in Belgian history, reflecting the collective grief and outrage of a nation betrayed by its institutions. The trial of Mark Dutrix began in 2004, nearly a decade after his arrest. It lasted months and was followed closely by the international press. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Survivors gave haunting testimony of their captivity. Families of victims described years of anguish. The videotapes and journals provided direct proof of his guilt. Dutrix attempted to manipulate the trial by claiming he had been part of a larger network of criminals involved in trafficking. These claims sparked conspiracy theories and added to public distrust, but they were never fully substantiated. Ultimately, Dutrix was convicted of multiple murders, kidnappings, and assaults. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. His wife, Michelle Martin, was also convicted and sentenced to 30 years, though she later received parole in 2012, a decision that once again outraged the public. The aftermath of the Dutrix case was far-reaching. It led to reforms in the Belgian police and judicial system, including better coordination between agencies, stricter sentencing for dangerous offenders, and improved procedures for handling missing persons. The case became a symbol of both the depths of human cruelty and the necessity of institutional accountability. Psychologists who studied Dutrix described him as a manipulative, narcissistic predator. He exhibited traits of antisocial personality disorder, with a total lack of empathy for his victims. He was motivated by control and domination, seeing his victims not as human beings, but as objects to satisfy his desires. His ability to live an outwardly ordinary life while secretly committing such atrocities remains one of the most chilling aspects of his story. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in history. It is the story of Rodney Alcala, a man whose charm, intelligence, and outward appearance concealed a pattern of violence and manipulation that terrorized women for decades. Known as the dating game killer, his case stands as one of the most chilling examples of how a predator can operate in plain sight while deceiving nearly everyone around him. Rodney James Alcala was born in 1943 in San Antonio, Texas. His early childhood was marked by instability. When he was young, his father abandoned the family, leaving his mother to raise the children alone. They relocated to Los Angeles, where Alcala grew up. Accounts from his youth describe him as intelligent, artistic, and gifted in school. He showed talent in photography and had an ability to draw people toward him with his personality. Yet beneath this outward image lay a growing tendency toward manipulation and control. Alcala joined the United States Army at the age of 17. He was stationed as a clerk, but his time in the military ended abruptly. In 1964, after suffering what was described as a nervous breakdown, he deserted his post. Military psychologists later diagnosed him with antisocial personality traits, and he was discharged on medical grounds. This episode revealed the instability and psychological issues that would continue to shape his life. By the late 1960s, Alcala had begun targeting women and children. In 1968, in Los Angeles, he committed one of his first known assaults. He lured an 8-year-old girl into his apartment and attacked her. A passerby intervened, and the girl survived, though severely injured. Alcala fled the state and was placed on the FBI's most wanted list. He adopted new identities, enrolled in college in New York, and even studied film under the famous director Roman Polanski. This ability to shift identities and blend into new environments became a hallmark of his predatory style. Eventually, Alcala was arrested and convicted for the 1968 assault, but the legal system at the time imposed light consequences. He served a short sentence and was released on parole in the early 1970s. Despite the clear evidence of his danger to society, parole boards granted him freedom multiple times. This repeated leniency allowed Alcala to continue his cycle of violence. Throughout the 1970s, Alcala refined his methods. He presented himself as a professional photographer, often approaching women and offering to take their pictures for modeling portfolios. He carried a camera and used his charm to gain trust. Many women agreed, not realizing that behind the lens was a predator who was studying, manipulating, and ultimately hunting them. Thousands of photographs were later found, showing women, teenagers, and children in posed and candid situations. Some of the individuals in these photographs remain unidentified to this day, raising chilling questions about the full extent of his crimes. Alcala's outward persona grew increasingly convincing. In 1978, he even appeared as a contestant on the popular television program, The Dating Game. On national television, he smiled, joked, and impressed the female contestant with his witty answers. He won the episode and was chosen for a date, though the woman later declined after sensing something unsettling about him. The fact that a serial predator could stand on stage and charm a national audience while actively committing crimes earned him the nickname the dating game killer. Behind this facade, Alcala's crimes were escalating. He was linked to murders across California, New York, and possibly other states. His victims were often young women, though investigators later connected him to children as well. The killings followed a pattern of manipulation, assault, and strangulation. Survivors described how he would sometimes strangle his victims until they lost consciousness, then allow them to recover briefly before repeating the act. This sadistic method revealed his desire for total control over life and death. One of his known victims was Jill Barkham, an 18-year-old runaway found murdered in Los Angeles in 1977. Another was Georgia Wickstead, a 27-year-old nurse whose body was discovered in 1978. Later victims included Charlotte Lamb, Jill Parento, and 12-year-old Robin Samso, whose disappearance and murder in 1979 finally brought Alcala into the full focus of law enforcement. The Samso case became the turning point. Robin disappeared while riding her bicycle to ballet class in Huntington Beach, California. Her remains were found 12 days later. Witnesses recalled seeing her with a man who matched Alcala's description and noted the presence of a camera. Police searched his storage locker, uncovering jewelry, keepsakes, and thousands of photographs. These items linked him to multiple victims and provided evidence of his predatory behavior. Alcala was arrested in 1979 and charged with Robin Samso's murder. His first trial led to a conviction, but it was overturned on appeal due to procedural issues. A second conviction followed, but was again overturned. It was not until 2010, after advances in DNA technology, that prosecutors secured a comprehensive conviction against him for 5 murders committed in California between 1977 and 1979. DNA evidence also linked him to additional crimes in New York and elsewhere. In total, investigators estimate that Alcala may have killed dozens of people, though the exact number remains unknown. During his trials, Alcala's behavior reflected his narcissism and manipulative tendencies. In his later trial, he chose to represent himself, questioning witnesses and even addressing the jury directly. At times he played recordings of the song Arlo Guthrie's Alice's Restaurant, seemingly mocking the proceedings. His lack of remorse and his insistence on controlling the courtroom underscored the psychological traits that had fueled his crimes. In 2010, Rodney Alcala was sentenced to death in California for the murders of 5 women and girls. Additional convictions followed in New York, where he was sentenced to 25 years to life for 2 more killings. Despite the convictions, law enforcement believes that Alcala's victim count was far higher, possibly reaching into the dozens or more. The photographs discovered in his storage unit remain a haunting archive, with many individuals still unidentified, leaving families to wonder whether their missing loved ones may have been among his victims. Alcala's health declined in prison, and he remained on death row for over a decade. In July 2021, he died of natural causes at the age of 77 while still awaiting execution. His death closed a chapter on his life, but left many unanswered questions about the true scale of his crimes. The case of Rodney Alcala serves as a chilling reminder of how predators can manipulate appearances to conceal their true nature. He was intelligent, articulate, and charming enough to convince television producers, parole boards, and even casual acquaintances that he was safe. Yet behind this mask, he was one of the most sadistic serial killers in American history. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in history. It is the story of Anatoly Onoprienko, a man whose actions in Ukraine during the 1990s earned him the names the Terminator and the Beast of Ukraine. His crimes were so shocking in their scale and brutality that they left entire towns in fear and reshaped how the country thought about violence. Anatoly Onoprienko was born in 1959 in the Zhytomyr region of Ukraine. His childhood was marked by neglect and hardship. When he was still very young, his mother died, and his father, unable to care for him, placed him in an orphanage. Growing up without a stable family or guidance, he developed deep feelings of abandonment and resentment. The orphanage system in the Soviet era was harsh, and Anatoly learned to survive through isolation and cruelty. Teachers and other children described him as withdrawn, but also prone to sudden bursts of anger. These early experiences played a major role in shaping his psychology. He grew up believing the world was hostile and uncaring, and in time, he would turn that belief into violence. As a young man, Anatoly briefly joined the Soviet military, but he did not last long in disciplined environments. He drifted from job to job, never forming lasting relationships. By the 1980s, he began to commit small crimes, burglaries, and thefts. He also traveled through Europe for a time, where he may have observed or even practiced violent crimes that were never discovered. What is clear is that by the early 1990s, back in Ukraine, he had decided to pursue murder on a scale almost without precedent. Onoprienko's method was chilling. He would select isolated houses, often in rural villages, where families lived far from neighbors. Armed with a shotgun or other weapons, he would break into the homes at night, kill everyone inside, and then set fire to the house to destroy evidence. He murdered entire families, men, women, and children, leaving no survivors. His attacks were often random, which created widespread panic because no one could predict where he would strike next. Unlike killers who target specific victims, Onoprienko's violence was indiscriminate. This made him even more terrifying. Between 1989 and 1996, he murdered at least 52 people, though some investigators believe the true number could have been higher. His crimes were methodical, yet also impulsive. Sometimes he would kill simply because a house seemed like an easy target. In other cases, he left behind small signs of planning, such as stealing weapons or vehicles. The randomness of his choices made the investigations difficult. In Ukraine during the early 1990s, the police and security forces were struggling. The collapse of the Soviet Union had left the country in turmoil. Institutions were weak, resources were scarce, and crime was rising across the nation. Onoprienko exploited this chaos. For years, he managed to avoid capture, moving quietly from one region to another. Each new set of murders caused fear to spread. Families locked themselves in their homes at night. Villages organized patrols, but it did little to stop him. The investigation into his crimes was one of the most complex in Ukrainian history. Initially, police suspected several different individuals, since the crimes were so widespread and brutal that it seemed impossible for one man to be responsible. For a time, attention even fell on innocent suspects who were wrongfully detained. This only deepened public frustration and fear. The breakthrough came in 1996, after a series of particularly brutal murders. Investigators began to see a clearer pattern. Tips from locals led them to Onoprienko, who had been living with a girlfriend at the time. When police raided his home, they discovered weapons, stolen property for victims, and detailed evidence linking him to the killings. Confronted with overwhelming proof, Onoprienko confessed. His confession was chilling in its calmness. He spoke about the murders as if they were simple acts of necessity, showing little remorse. He explained his methods step by step, acknowledging the families he had destroyed. His trial in 1998 was one of the most publicized in Ukrainian history. The courtroom was packed with families of victims, journalists, and officials. People wanted to understand how a single man could commit such atrocities. Throughout the proceedings, Onoprienko remained detached. He admitted to 52 murders, describing them in detail. Psychologists evaluated him and concluded that he showed traits of severe antisocial personality disorder. He lacked empathy, exhibited extreme aggression, and was driven by impulses he claimed he could not control. The court sentenced him to death, the maximum penalty in Ukraine at the time. However, shortly after, Ukraine declared a moratorium on the death penalty in line with European human rights agreements. His sentence was commuted to life imprisonment without parole. He was sent to a maximum security prison, where he spent the rest of his days. In 2013, Anatoly Onoprienko died of heart failure in his cell at the age of 54. The aftermath of his crimes left deep scars. Communities that lost entire families struggled for years. The Ukrainian justice system faced criticism for its failures during the investigation. The case also highlighted the difficulties faced by countries in transition, where weak institutions allow violent individuals to exploit chaos. For many, Onoprienko became a symbol of the darkest possibilities of human nature. Today, his name remains one of the most feared in Eastern Europe. His crimes are studied as an example of how random, large-scale violence can terrorize entire regions. The memory of his victims lives on, and the story of the Beast of Ukraine serves as a grim reminder of the devastation a single individual can cause when unchecked by law and society. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in history. It is the story of Javed Iqbal, a man whose actions in Lahore, Pakistan, during the late 1990s shocked the world and revealed a level of cruelty almost impossible to comprehend. His crimes left families devastated, communities terrified, and a nation struggling to understand how such horrors could occur. Javed Iqbal was born in 1956 in Lahore, Pakistan. His childhood was marked by neglect, social isolation, and early exposure to moral confusion. While details of his early family life are limited, accounts suggest that he was an intelligent child, academically capable, but socially withdrawn. He struggled to form normal attachments and demonstrated early tendencies toward obsessive and controlling behavior. Teachers recalled that he often appeared detached from the emotions of those around him, and he rarely formed lasting friendships. As a young adult, Iqbal's intelligence became more pronounced. He was a diligent student and pursued work in commerce and small business. Despite his outward appearance of normalcy, he was developing a dark fascination with control and domination. He began to view vulnerable children as objects to manipulate and exploit. This fixation escalated in secrecy, as he simultaneously maintained a facade of being a polite, educated, and law-abiding citizen. In the early 1990s, Javed Iqbal began committing his crimes. He targeted street children and orphans, often luring them with promises of shelter, food, and money. Many of his victims were boys who had been abandoned or marginalized, making them particularly vulnerable. Once he gained their trust, Iqbal would assault, torture, and ultimately murder them. His methods were horrifyingly methodical. He often strangled his victims and then disposed of their bodies in secret locations. The scale of Iqbal's crimes grew rapidly. Over a period of approximately 2 years, he murdered at least 100 boys, though some estimates suggest the number could have been even higher. To cover his tracks, he employed techniques to prevent identification, including dissolving bodies in chemical solutions. He kept detailed notes and a notebook listing his victims, demonstrating both obsession and a chilling sense of pride in his actions. Iqbal's crimes went undetected for years, largely because he targeted the most vulnerable members of society. Street children, orphans, and those without families were unlikely to be reported missing promptly, giving him the ability to continue without immediate consequence. He was meticulous in maintaining appearances, presenting himself as a respectable businessman and responsible citizen. This duality allowed him to operate in plain sight while committing acts of unimaginable horror. The turning point in the investigation came in 1999 when police discovered evidence connecting Iqbal to several missing children. A tip-off led authorities to his residence in Lahore, where they found his notebooks, chemical containers, and other incriminating evidence. The scale of the documentation revealed the full extent of his crimes, listing hundreds of names and demonstrating a level of premeditation that was staggering. When confronted, Javed Iqbal confessed to his murders. He described his actions in detail, explaining how he would lure children, commit assaults, and then dispose of their bodies. He showed no apparent remorse, speaking about his crimes as if they were a logical sequence of events. Psychologists later evaluated him and concluded that he displayed severe antisocial personality disorder, sadistic tendencies, and a profound lack of empathy. His ability to compartmentalize normal life from his violent acts exemplified the psychological profile of an organized and calculating serial killer. Iqbal was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, abuse, and sexual assault. The trial was a national sensation, drawing attention not only to the crimes themselves, but also to systemic failures in protecting vulnerable populations. Families of victims provided testimony that was harrowing in its detail, recounting the years of fear and uncertainty. The media extensively covered the trial, which brought to light both the depravity of Iqbal's actions and the social context that allowed him to operate. During the trial, Javed Iqbal continued to display manipulative behavior. He attempted to challenge evidence, provide alternate narratives, and use his intelligence to complicate proceedings. Nevertheless, The overwhelming evidence, including his detailed victim records and physical evidence, ensured a conviction. The court sentenced him to death. The verdict was widely supported by the public, who saw it as necessary justice for the scale of his crimes. However, before his execution could be carried out, Javed Iqbal died in police custody in 2001. He had reportedly hanged himself in his cell, bringing an abrupt end to his life, but leaving many questions unresolved. His death prevented a full legal closure for many families, though the documentation he left behind offered evidence of the magnitude of his crimes and provided closure in terms of identifying his victims. The aftermath of Iqbal's case had profound implications for Pakistan. Law enforcement agencies faced criticism for failing to detect his crimes earlier, particularly in communities with large populations of street children and orphans. The case prompted reforms in child protection policies, efforts to improve monitoring of vulnerable populations, and initiatives to educate the public about the risks of exploitation. Social workers, psychologists, and law enforcement used the case to develop better strategies for prevention and intervention. Psychological studies of Javed Iqbal highlighted the complexities of his mind. He was not a spontaneous or impulsive killer. His intelligence allowed him to plan meticulously, manipulate those around him, and commit crimes without immediate detection. His lack of remorse, combined with his ability to present a normal facade, made him extraordinarily dangerous. He serves as an example of how predators can exploit societal vulnerabilities while remaining hidden in plain sight. Today, the story of Javed Iqbal remains one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of crime. His actions destroyed lives, terrorized communities, and revealed the darkest aspects of human behavior. Yet his crimes also prompted important changes in child protection, policing, and public awareness, ensuring that some good emerged from the tragedy. His name is remembered as a cautionary symbol of the importance of vigilance, empathy, and the protection of the most vulnerable members of society. Javed Iqbal's story is not just a tale of murder. It is a haunting reminder of how intelligence, charm, and manipulation can be weaponized to commit acts of profound evil. It illustrates the vulnerabilities in society that allow predators to flourish and underscores the enduring importance of justice, protection, and awareness. Even decades later, the victims he claimed are remembered, and the lessons of his crimes continue to inform law enforcement and child protection practices around the world. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in history. It is the story of Charles Cullen, a man who spent decades killing patients under his care while working as a nurse in hospitals across New Jersey and Pennsylvania. His crimes revealed a horrifying abuse of trust and exposed weaknesses in the healthcare system that allowed him to continue for years undetected. Charles Edmund Cullen was born in 1960 in West Orange, New Jersey. His childhood was marked by instability, emotional neglect, and early exposure to social and psychological challenges. He was described as a quiet, introverted child, often withdrawing from others. He showed signs of depression and struggled to form healthy emotional connections. Despite these difficulties, he was intelligent and capable, traits that would later help him evade detection for years. Cullen trained as a nurse, completing his education in the late 1970s. He quickly found work in hospitals, where he initially performed his duties competently. However, colleagues noted that he sometimes exhibited mood swings and occasional outbursts of anger. These early warning signs were not taken seriously at the time, as he appeared generally professional and maintained a quiet demeanor. Cullen's killing began in the late 1980s. He started by administering lethal doses of medications to patients, often targeting those who were elderly, critically ill, or otherwise vulnerable. His methods were subtle, making it appear as though patients had died from natural causes or complications of their existing illnesses. This ability to blend his actions into the expected patterns of hospital mortality allowed him to avoid suspicion. Over the next 2 decades, Cullen moved between hospitals, often leaving positions before colleagues noticed patterns in patient deaths. In total, he worked at more than a dozen medical facilities, Each move allowed him to continue killing without raising red flags. Hospitals did not communicate effectively about suspicious deaths, and oversight was minimal, which enabled Cullen to continue his killing spree for years. It is believed that Charles Cullen murdered at least 40 patients, though the exact number may be higher. Victims included both men and women, primarily in their elderly years or suffering from serious medical conditions. His method of killing primarily involved the administration of overdoses of medications, such as digoxin, insulin, and other cardiac drugs. These overdoses often caused heart failure or sudden death, and because the patients were already vulnerable, the deaths appeared consistent with medical expectations. Cullen's motivations were complex and sometimes contradictory. In interviews after his arrest, he claimed he derived a sense of satisfaction from ending suffering, though investigators rejected this as a rationalization. Psychologists described him as having antisocial personality traits, including a lack of empathy, chronic manipulation, and a willingness to kill without remorse. He displayed both careful planning and opportunism, selecting victims based on accessibility and vulnerability. The first serious investigation into Cullen's activities began in the late 1990s when hospital administrators and colleagues noticed unusually high death rates in units where he worked. Patterns emerged linking sudden cardiac deaths and unexplained overdoses to patients under his care. The investigation revealed that Cullen had been able to exploit weaknesses in hospital reporting systems and the lack of coordination between institutions. Despite early suspicions, no arrests were made until he confessed voluntarily during a police investigation in 2003. Cullen's confession stunned authorities. He admitted to killing dozens of patients across multiple hospitals, providing detailed accounts of how he administered lethal doses and how he avoided detection. He explained that he had moved frequently to avoid scrutiny and that he had chosen victims strategically. His calm recounting of these murders was chilling, revealing both his meticulous planning and the ease with which he had circumvented oversight. The trial and investigation that followed were extraordinary in their scope. Prosecutors in New Jersey and Pennsylvania worked to understand the full extent of Cullen's crimes, interviewing colleagues, reviewing medical records, and analyzing patient deaths over decades. The legal proceedings focused not only on the murders themselves, but also on systemic failures in the healthcare system that allowed a nurse to kill patients over such an extended period. In 2006, Charles Cullen pleaded guilty to multiple counts of murder and attempted murder as part of a plea agreement. The agreement was designed to avoid lengthy trials while ensuring he would spend the remainder of his life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms, ensuring that he would never be released. Cullen's admission, while providing closure for some families, also left lingering questions about the total number of victims. Many cases remained unresolved, and investigators continue to believe that his death toll may be higher than officially confirmed. The aftermath of Cullen's crimes prompted widespread reforms in healthcare oversight. Hospitals implemented stricter monitoring of medication administration, improved reporting systems, and mandatory reviews of unusual patient deaths. Regulatory bodies strengthened procedures to prevent similar abuses of trust in the future. Cullen's case became a central study in criminal psychology, medical ethics, and hospital administration, emphasizing the importance of vigilance and accountability in healthcare settings. Psychologists studying Charles Cullen concluded that his ability to maintain a professional facade while committing murders reflected deep-seated antisocial tendencies. He demonstrated remarkable patience, control, and cunning, traits that allowed him to manipulate his environment and evade detection. His actions highlighted the vulnerability of patients in institutional care and the devastating consequences of unchecked authority. Charles Cullen died in prison in 2021. His life and crimes remain a stark reminder of the potential for human cruelty to hide behind ordinary appearances and trusted positions. The victims he took are remembered through ongoing investigations, memorials, and studies designed to prevent future tragedies. Cullen's story is a cautionary tale about the need for oversight ethical responsibility, and constant vigilance in any institution where lives are entrusted to others. The story of Charles Cullen is not only one of murder, but also one of betrayal, exploitation, and systemic failure. He turned his position of trust into an instrument of death, leaving families devastated and communities shaken. His crimes changed how hospitals and regulators approach patient safety, serving as a haunting reminder that evil can sometimes hide behind the most ordinary faces and places. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in history. It is the story of Leonard Lake, a man whose carefully planned and horrifying actions terrorized Northern California during the 1980s and revealed the terrifying potential of human cruelty. Leonard Lake was born in 1945 in San Francisco, California. From an early age, his life was marked by instability, isolation, and difficulty forming meaningful social connections. Neighbors and family later recalled that he was a shy and withdrawn child, prone to spending long hours alone. He exhibited early interests in firearms, military tactics, and survival techniques, often practicing with small weapons and reading extensively about combat and control. These interests were not unusual in isolation, but combined with his solitary tendencies and fascination with dominance, they became early indicators of darker impulses. As a teenager, Lake struggled socially and academically. He experienced rejection and bullying from peers, which deepened his sense of alienation. Reports suggest that he began exhibiting controlling and obsessive behaviors during adolescence. He also developed an early interest in pornography and sexual fantasy, particularly those involving domination and control. These patterns of thought and behavior would become central to his criminal life. Lake briefly served in the United States Marine Corps. During his time in the military, he gained skills in survival, firearms, and discipline. However, he failed to integrate these skills into a conventional civilian life. Instead, they were later repurposed to support his violent fantasies. After leaving the military, he moved frequently, taking odd jobs, avoiding long-term commitments, and seeking isolation whenever possible. This transient lifestyle gave him the opportunity to study communities, observe routines, and find potential victims without attracting attention. In the mid-1970s, Leonard Lake met Charles Ng, a younger man who shared some of his interests in violence, control, and fantasy. Their partnership became central to the crimes that would later define Lake's legacy. Together, they developed a system for abducting, imprisoning, and killing victims. The two men complemented each other. Lake was methodical, obsessive, and organized, while Ng provided energy and a willingness to participate in acts of violence. Lake's most notorious act was the construction of a hidden bunker on a property he purchased in Wilseyville, California. The bunker was carefully designed to imprison victims, store weapons, and allow him to carry out his crimes in complete isolation. It included locks, chains, and other implements to control victims' movements. Lake kept detailed journals, photographs, and lists documenting his fantasies, his methods, and his plans. This level of organization demonstrated a high degree of premeditation and forethought, making his crimes particularly chilling. Lake targeted women who were vulnerable and could be manipulated or overpowered. He lured victims using promises of work, shelter, or companionship, exploiting trust to gain control. Once abducted, victims were subjected to confinement, assault, and often murder. He frequently videotaped his acts, creating a record of the terror he inflicted, which later provided investigators with evidence of his premeditated cruelty. He often employed a combination of restraint, coercion, and psychological manipulation to maintain control, displaying traits consistent with sexual sadism and antisocial personality disorder. During the period of his criminal activity, the public remained largely unaware of the danger he posed. Communities in Northern California were left shocked when his crimes were finally uncovered. Families of missing persons struggled for years without answers, and law enforcement initially faced difficulty connecting disappearances that occurred across county lines. Lake's careful planning, isolated locations, and transient movements allowed him to evade detection for an extended period. The investigation intensified in 1985 after Charles Ng was detained on an unrelated weapons charge. Under questioning, Ng led authorities to Lake's Wilseyville property. There, investigators discovered the hidden bunker, containing human remains, personal effects, weapons, and detailed records of Lake's activities. The evidence revealed the horrifying scale and systematic nature of his crimes, including multiple murders, assaults, and abductions. Authorities confirmed that Lake had killed numerous victims over several years, although the full number may never be known. Psychological analysis of Leonard Lake after his death highlighted the extreme antisocial tendencies, sexual sadism, and obsessive need for control that defined his behavior. He demonstrated the ability to maintain an outwardly ordinary persona while carrying out acts of extraordinary cruelty. His meticulous planning, attention to detail, and creation of a secure facility for his crimes set him apart from impulsive offenders. Lake operated in a calculated and methodical manner, combining patience, observation, and planning to ensure the success of his attacks. Faced with imminent arrest, Leonard Lake chose to end his own life in 1985. His death prevented a complete legal reckoning, but Charles Ng was subsequently prosecuted and convicted for the crimes they had committed together. The trial revealed the full extent of Lake's predatory behavior, the meticulous planning behind his acts, and the suffering inflicted upon his victims. Families of the victims described the trauma and fear that had haunted them for years, and investigators detailed the painstaking work required to uncover and understand Lake's methods. The aftermath of Leonard Lake's crimes had profound and lasting consequences. Law enforcement agencies reviewed and improved practices related to missing persons, interagency cooperation, and tracking transient offenders. His case became a central study in criminal psychology, illustrating how a person could combine outward normalcy with calculated, methodical violence in private. It also prompted greater awareness of the potential for organized predatory behavior, highlighting the importance of vigilance and forensic investigation. Leonard Lake's story is a chilling reminder of the depths of human cruelty. He combined intelligence, patience, and meticulous planning to commit acts of extreme violence. He preyed on the vulnerable, exploited trust, and created a hidden world where terror could unfold without interruption. Even decades after his death, his crimes continue to serve as a case study in psychology, criminal investigation, and the consequences of predatory behavior. The meticulousness of his planning, the horror of his actions, and the enduring trauma experienced by survivors and families mark Leonard Lake as one of the most disturbing figures in American criminal history. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in history. It is the story of Yang Xinhai, a man whose brutal and methodical killings shook rural China and left a legacy of fear that still lingers today. Yang Xinhai was born in 1968 in Hunan Province, China. From a young age, his life was marked by hardship and social isolation. He grew up in a poor family, with parents struggling to provide for their children. Yang was a quiet, withdrawn child, often spending long hours alone. Neighbors recalled that he was physically small for his age and frequently bullied by other children. These early experiences of rejection and isolation contributed to a growing sense of resentment and anger. As a teenager, Yang struggled academically and socially. He dropped out of school early and began drifting from place to place, taking odd jobs wherever he could. His early adult years were marked by petty theft and occasional violence. Reports later revealed that he had committed assaults and burglaries before escalating to more serious crimes. Experts believe that his early experiences of poverty, neglect, and social marginalization combined with latent violent tendencies to form the foundation for his later predatory behavior. Yang's adult life was transient. He traveled extensively across rural China, often taking temporary labor jobs. This mobility gave him the opportunity to observe and study the routines of villages and communities. He developed a methodical approach to selecting victims. Typically, he targeted isolated households in small towns or remote villages, where people lived alone or in small family units. He studied patterns, watching the comings and goings of people and noting when homes would be empty or vulnerable. Beginning in the late 1990s, Yang's crimes escalated into a spree of extreme violence. He would enter homes late at night, often using brute force to gain access. His attacks were sudden, brutal, and meticulously executed. Victims were usually killed with hammers, axes, or knives. There was little warning, and the violence was overwhelming. Entire families were sometimes murdered, leaving behind scenes of terror and devastation. He was careful to avoid leaving evidence that could easily identify him, frequently wearing gloves and taking precautions to avoid detection. The scale and pattern of Yang's crimes caused widespread fear in rural communities. Villagers were terrified to be alone at night. People began to lock doors and keep watch in groups, but the unpredictability of his attacks made the fear pervasive. Authorities were initially unable to connect the murders, partly due to the geographic spread of his attacks. He operated across multiple provinces, which made investigation coordination difficult and slowed the identification of a pattern. Yang's psychological profile was disturbing. Experts who later studied his case identified traits consistent with extreme antisocial personality disorder. He demonstrated a total lack of empathy, deriving satisfaction from the suffering of others. He was methodical, patient, and highly organized in his approach. Unlike many criminals who act impulsively, Yang planned his attacks with precision. He would observe, wait for opportunities, and strike when victims were most vulnerable. His calm demeanor in public and transient lifestyle allowed him to blend into communities while committing violent acts in private. Authorities eventually pieced together the pattern of killings in the early 2000s. Investigators cross-referenced missing persons reports, unusual deaths, and witness accounts. Breakthroughs came when survivors and eyewitnesses provided descriptions of a suspicious man seen near crime scenes. Law enforcement used a combination of interviews, crime scene reconstruction, and emerging forensic methods to track his movements. Yang Xinhai was finally arrested in 2003. Evidence linked him to at least 67 murders and multiple assaults, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in Chinese history. The trial revealed the horrifying scope of his crimes, the meticulous planning involved, and the terror he had inflicted on countless communities. Witnesses recounted their fear and trauma. Survivors described narrow escapes, and investigators detailed the painstaking work required to apprehend him. He was convicted and sentenced to death. Yang remained calm during proceedings, showing little emotion or remorse. The sentence was carried out in 2004, bringing an official end to his spree of violence. Yet the impact of his crimes continued to resonate. Families mourned lost relatives, communities took years to recover their sense of security, and law enforcement incorporated lessons from the case into methods for tracking transient offenders and connecting widely dispersed crimes. The story of Yang Xinhai is a chilling reminder of the depths of human cruelty. His ability to operate undetected for years, the meticulousness of his planning, and the sheer brutality of his crimes make him one of the most terrifying figures in modern criminal history. He targeted the most vulnerable, struck without warning, and left a trail of destruction that shaped communities and criminal investigation practices for years to come. Even today, his crimes are studied in China and internationally as examples of how poverty, social isolation, and unchecked violent tendencies can combine to create a predator capable of extreme destruction. The terror he instilled, the lives he destroyed, and the fear that gripped entire rural provinces mark Yang Xinhai as a haunting figure whose story remains one of the darkest chapters in criminal history. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in history. It is the story of Robert Hansen, a man whose actions terrorized Alaska for more than a decade. His crimes went undetected for years, and he managed to live among ordinary people while carrying out acts of unimaginable cruelty. Robert Hansen was born in 1939 in Esterville, Iowa. From the beginning, he was a quiet, introverted child. He suffered from frequent illnesses, including asthma, which kept him isolated from his peers and made social interaction difficult. His early childhood was marked by loneliness. He spent hours observing the world around him, especially the natural environment and animals. This fascination with hunting and firearms would shape his later life in profound ways. Even as a young boy, Hansen displayed disturbing tendencies. He had a fascination with trapping and harming animals. Neighbors and relatives later recalled incidents where he would set traps for small creatures, sometimes killing them without remorse. These behaviors were early warning signs of a lack of empathy and a fascination with control over weaker beings. In school, Hansen was often bullied and ostracized, deepening his sense of isolation. He retreated further into solitary activities, reading, observing, and imagining scenarios in which he held power over others. As a young man, Hansen moved to Anchorage, Alaska. There, he pursued work as a baker, eventually opened his own small bakery. To the outside world, he appeared calm, polite, and respectable. Neighbors saw him as a quiet, professional man, unremarkable and trustworthy. This appearance of normalcy masked the dark compulsions that he harbored. Hansen's calm demeanor and attention to routine allowed him to operate unnoticed while he planned his crimes. Hansen's crimes began in the 1970s. He targeted women who were vulnerable, often sex workers or women alone in public areas. He would carefully observe potential victims, learning their routines and patterns. Using his van, he would lure them under the pretense of offering rides, jobs, or companionship. Once he gained control over them, he transported them to remote areas of the Alaskan wilderness. His knowledge of the land and hunting skills allowed him to select isolated locations where no one would find the victims. Once in the wilderness, Hansen's predatory instincts were fully revealed. He would restrain his victims and, in some cases, sexually assault them. In other cases, he would release them and pursue them through the forest, shooting at them as if they were game. He took pleasure in the fear and panic he created, viewing these women not as human beings, but as objects to dominate and hunt. His meticulous planning and patience made him extremely difficult to catch. He would often bury victims in unmarked graves, scatter evidence, and use the natural terrain to hide his crimes. The impact of his crimes on the community was profound, though it developed gradually. At first, disappearances were treated as isolated incidents. Families reported missing daughters, and friends searched in vain for answers. Women began to alter their behavior, avoiding certain areas and traveling in groups. The growing fear was subtle but pervasive. Law enforcement struggled to see the connection between cases. Hansen's careful selection of victims and his mobile approach allowed him to evade detection for years. Hansen's psychology was complex. Experts later determined that he had antisocial tendencies combined with sexual sadism. He was capable of maintaining a normal life, operating a business, and interacting with neighbors without raising suspicion. Yet privately, he acted on violent fantasies with meticulous calculation. He derived pleasure from exerting control over his victims and manipulating their fear. This duality, ordinary by day, predator by night, was central to his ability to continue for so long. Investigations into his crimes intensified in the early 1980s. A combination of forensic analysis, witness testimony, and law enforcement collaboration finally began to unravel his activities. One survivor provided crucial information that enabled authorities to identify Hansen. The pattern became evident. Vulnerable women were targeted, abducted, transported in his van, and disposed of in remote wilderness areas. Evidence included personal items belonging to victims, forensic traces, and eyewitness accounts of his interactions with women prior to abduction. Eventually, he was linked to at least 17 murders, though it is widely believed the number of victims may have been higher. Hansen's arrest in 1983 brought a wave of relief, but also horror as the details emerged. The trial revealed the full extent of his methodical cruelty. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, including detailed accounts from surviving victims, physical evidence from crime scenes, and witness statements. Victims' families confronted Hansen in court, recounting years of fear and grief. Hansen maintained a composed, calm demeanor throughout the trial, showing little outward remorse. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The aftermath of Hansen's crimes had a lasting effect on Alaska and beyond. Communities were forced to confront the vulnerabilities of women and the hidden dangers present even in quiet towns. Law enforcement agencies improved procedures for missing person cases, emphasized interagency cooperation, and advanced forensic and investigative techniques. Hansen's case became a prominent example in criminal psychology, illustrating the dangers posed by individuals capable of maintaining a normal facade while engaging in violent, compulsive behavior in private. Hansen remained in prison until his death in 2014. His story is a chilling reminder of the darkness that can exist behind ordinary appearances. He hunted his victims like game, exploiting his knowledge of human behavior and the wilderness to evade capture. The terror he created, the lives he destroyed, and the fear that gripped entire communities make Robert Hansen one of the most haunting figures in the history of American crime. His crimes are studied not only for their brutality, but also for their lessons about vigilance, forensic investigation, and the hidden duality in human behavior. They remind us that appearances can be deceiving and that the ordinary can conceal the extraordinary darkness. The story of Robert Hansen endures as a cautionary tale of methodical evil and the profound consequences of unchecked predatory impulses. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest and most unsettling crimes in Japanese history. It is the story of Miyuki Ishikawa, a woman who came to be called the Demon Midwife. In the years immediately after the Second World War, when Japan was struggling with poverty, hunger, and devastation, she was entrusted with the care of newborn children. Instead of protecting them, she oversaw their deaths. By the time her crimes were exposed, it was believed that dozens, perhaps more than 100 infants had perished under her watch, making her one of the most prolific killers in Japan's history. Her case shocked the country not only for its brutality, but also for what it revealed about the hardships of the era and the failures of system that allowed so many vulnerable lives to be lost. Miyuki Ishikawa was born in 1897 in southern Japan. She came of age in a period when the nation was rapidly modernizing, yet still deeply tied to traditional expectations. She received an education and eventually trained as a midwife, a respected profession that gave her authority within her community. By the 1940s, she had risen to a position of prominence, serving as director of a maternity hospital in Tokyo. Outwardly, she was seen as a responsible and skilled woman. In a society still heavily influenced by hierarchy and respect for authority, her role commanded trust. Parents believed they were leaving their newborns in safe hands. Few would have suspected that behind this professional image lay choices that would lead to mass death. The backdrop of her crimes is important. In the late 1940s, Japan was reeling from the devastation of the war. Cities had been bombed, the economy was in ruins, and food shortages were severe. Families struggled to provide for themselves, let alone for new children. At the same time, birth control was limited, abortion was restricted, and many women became pregnant without support. In such desperate circumstances, unwanted children were often abandoned or placed into institutions. The hospital where Ishikawa worked became one of the places where these infants were sent. But instead of offering them a chance at survival, the hospital under her care became a site of systematic neglect and death. Ishikawa, together with her husband and a doctor who worked alongside her, developed a chilling practice. When poor families brought infants they could not afford to raise, she did not provide care or seek adoption. Instead, she allowed the children to die, often by deliberate neglect. In many cases, the infants were left without adequate food or medical treatment until they perished. At times, more direct methods were used to hasten death. The justification she later offered was that she was relieving parents of burdens they could not manage. In her view, and in the view of her accomplices, the deaths were acts of mercy that spared families from financial ruin. But behind such rationalizations was the stark fact that she had taken it upon herself to decide who would live and who would die. The scale of the deaths grew over time. Records were poorly kept, and many infants were never formally registered, which allowed the crimes to continue in the shadows. Families who delivered babies to Ishikawa often never saw them again. Some parents may have suspected what was happening but felt powerless in the face of authority. Others perhaps accepted her assurances that their children would be placed in care. Over the course of several years, the number of dead mounted. When investigators later attempted to piece together the extent of the killings, estimates range from dozens to more than 100. The true figure has never been confirmed. The crimes came to light almost by accident in 1948. Police discovered the bodies of several infants, abandoned and left to decay. Tracing them back led to Ishikawa's hospital. As the investigation deepened, the extent of the deaths became undeniable. Corpses of babies were found in alarming numbers, some hidden, others discarded. Shock spread through the community as the truth emerged that the very institution entrusted with care had instead become a place of death. Ishikawa and her husband were arrested, as was the doctor who had assisted in covering up the deaths. The revelations horrified the public. Japan was already facing immense hardship, but few could comprehend how a professional midwife had carried out such acts. During her trial, Ishikawa's defense argued that she acted under the pressures of poverty and overpopulation. She claimed that parents abandoned children with her because they could not support them and that the government had failed to provide welfare or assistance. Her lawyers contended that the responsibility was not hers alone, but also the fault of a system that left families desperate and offered no safety net for unwanted children. The prosecution, however, emphasized that no matter the circumstances, she had a duty to preserve life, not destroy it. The sheer number of deaths revealed a deliberate and sustained practice, not isolated acts. In 1952, Miyuki Ishikawa was convicted. She received a surprisingly light sentence of only 8 years, later reduced to 4 on appeal. Her husband and the doctor received even lesser punishments. To many, the leniency of the court was almost as shocking as the crimes themselves. It reflected, in part, a recognition of the social conditions of post-war Japan. Authorities seemed to accept that poverty and desperation had played a role in the tragedy. Yet for the families who lost children, justice seemed far from served. The light sentences fueled outrage and left deep questions about accountability. The aftermath of the case had lasting consequences. Public outcry over the deaths, and the trial drew attention to the plight of poor families and the lack of support for mothers. It contributed to changes in Japanese law, including reforms that expanded access to birth control and legalized abortion under certain conditions. Policymakers recognized that preventing unwanted pregnancies and providing better welfare for children was essential to avoid such tragedies in the future. In this way, the case of Miyuki Ishikawa became a grim turning point that exposed the human cost of neglect and forced the country to confront uncomfortable truths about social responsibility. Miyuki Ishikawa faded into obscurity after her release from prison. Little is known of her later life, but her name remains infamous in Japan's criminal history. The image of a trusted midwife who oversaw the deaths of infants continues to haunt collective memory. Her case stands as a chilling reminder that evil can take forms that do not fit the usual image of violence. It can hide behind respectability, professional authority, and even the appearance of care. The story of the demon midwife is remembered not only for the sheer scale of the deaths, but also for what it revealed about a society in crisis. It showed how desperation, poverty, and inadequate systems can create conditions where life is devalued, and it demonstrated the catastrophic consequences when those in positions of trust betray their most sacred duty. The infants whose lives were taken never had the chance to be remembered individually, but together they represent one of the darkest tragedies of post-war Japan. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in German history. It is the story of Joachim Kroll, the man who came to be known as the Ruhr Cannibal. For more than 2 decades, he moved quietly through industrial towns along the Ruhr River, a shy factory worker who lived alone and kept to himself. Behind his timid appearance, He carried out a series of murders so disturbing that even seasoned investigators struggled to process what they uncovered. His acts of violence and cannibalism created one of the most haunting chapters in European crime history, and the way his crimes were discovered still chills those who read about it today. Joachim Kroll was born in 1933 in Hindenburg, a part of Germany that would later become Poland after the Second World War. He grew up in a large poor family, the son of a miner. Childhood for Kroll was marked by deprivation and instability. Food was scarce, the war shattered communities, and his father was taken prisoner by the Soviet Union. Teachers and neighbors described young Joachim as a slow learner who had difficulty reading and writing. He was considered simple-minded and often ridiculed by classmates. He had no close friends and spent much of his childhood in isolation. Even as a teenager, he was seen as awkward and withdrawn. His family eventually relocated to North Rhine-Westphalia, where Kroll would live out much of his life in industrial towns that were rebuilding after the war. Psychologists later observed that his development was arrested at an early stage. His intelligence level was measured as borderline, and he displayed signs of emotional immaturity. While other young men began to form relationships and pursue work, Kroll remained isolated. He drifted from job to job, mostly unskilled labor in factories. He never married and never established meaningful friendships. Neighbors described him as a strange but harmless man who often kept small animals and sometimes appeared overly attached to them. Beneath this lonely exterior, however, Kroll was developing urges that he did not know how to control. He later admitted that he began harming animals in his youth, practicing cruelty on rabbits, cats, and dogs. It was the early sign of the violence he would later direct toward humans. The first known killing occurred in 1955. Kroll was 22 years old when he murdered a young woman named Irmgard Strell. He strangled her in a field near the town of Duisburg and mutilated her body. Unlike many killers who commit their first crime and then recoil in fear, Kroll experienced the opposite. He found satisfaction in the act and confessed later that it gave him a release he had never felt before. Over the next 2 decades, he killed repeatedly, striking in towns across the Ruhr region. His victims included women and young girls, often chosen at random when opportunity presented itself. He would lure them, strangle them, and then mutilate their bodies. In several cases, he engaged in acts of cannibalism, cutting pieces of flesh to take home and cook. He later explained to police that during times of food shortages, he believed this would help save money on groceries. Kroll's murders followed a grim pattern. He struck suddenly, with little planning, and often near his own neighborhood. After killing, he disposed of bodies in rivers, fields, or abandoned industrial areas. Despite the brutality, he managed to avoid detection for years. Police in the region were overwhelmed with crime in post-war Germany, and disappearances were often treated as isolated events. Forensic science in the 1950s and 1960s lacked the tools available today. The scattered nature of Kroll's crimes meant investigators did not immediately connect them. Families grieved without answers, while Kroll quietly returned to his factory shifts and lived in his modest apartment. As the years passed, suspicions about him never seemed to take root. Neighbors described him as odd but non-threatening. He lived alone, kept his flat cluttered but not alarming, and often greeted others politely. He was regarded as simple, even childlike, and therefore overlooked as a possible threat. This image helped shield him while he continued his spree. He killed at least 14 people between 1955 and 1976, though some estimates suggest there may have been more. His victims ranged in age from young girls to adult women, their lives taken suddenly by a man who often claimed afterward that he simply wanted companionship, but could only achieve it through control and violence. The discovery of his crimes came in the summer of 1976 in the most horrifying way. Neighbors in his apartment building noticed that the pipes were clogged and sewage was backing up. A maintenance worker was called to investigate the blockage. What he found inside the pipes shocked him. Pieces of human flesh were lodged in the system, clogging the flow of water. Police were alerted immediately. They questioned residents, and suspicion fell on Joachim Kroll. When officers entered his apartment, they discovered an even more disturbing scene. In his kitchen, they found cooking utensils, pans, and a refrigerator containing pieces of human flesh. On the stove, a pot simmered with carrots and potatoes alongside meat that investigators confirmed was human. Kroll was arrested at once. Under interrogation, he calmly confessed to a series of murders spanning 2 decades. He recounted details of killings in a matter-of-fact tone, showing little understanding of the enormity of his actions. He admitted to killing women and children, often strangling them, and then cutting off pieces of their bodies to eat. His explanations revealed both a disturbed mind and a chilling lack of remorse. He spoke as if the murders were simply part of his life, necessary acts to fulfill urges he could not control. For investigators, the confessions tied together a long list of unsolved cases that had haunted the Ruhr area for years. Families who had wondered what happened to their loved ones finally received answers, though the truth was more horrific than they could have imagined. The trial of Joachim Kroll began in 1982, several years after his arrest, due to the need for thorough psychiatric evaluations and the gathering of evidence across multiple crime scenes. Court proceedings revealed his simple manner of speech and his childlike behavior. Psychiatrists described him as severely mentally impaired but still responsible for his actions. The defense argued that he lacked full comprehension, while the prosecution emphasized the repeated nature of his crimes and the danger he posed to society. In the courtroom, the families of victims listened in anguish as the murders were described in detail. The image of this shy, awkward man sitting quietly in the dock contrasted sharply with the brutality of his acts. In 1982, Joachim Kroll was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. He was incarcerated in a high-security facility where he lived out his remaining years. Even in prison, he remained isolated, spending much of his time alone, still regarded by others as strange and simple. He died in 1991 of a heart attack at the age of 58. His death closed a chapter on one of Germany's most infamous killers, but the scars left behind remained with the families of his victims and the communities he had haunted for more than 20 years. Next story. I am going to tell you the story of Otis Elwood Toole, a man who drifted through life like a shadow, carrying with him the scars of abuse, poverty, and neglect, and leaving behind a trail of horror, unanswered questions, and devastating pain. His life was not one of grand schemes or intricate manipulations, but of chaos, confusion, and violence. He was a killer who confessed and retracted, who blurred the line between truth and lies, who may have taken many lives but left the world never fully certain of what he had actually done. And that uncertainty, that emptiness, is what makes his story one of the most haunting in the history of American true crime. Otis Toole was born on March 5, 1947, in Jacksonville, Florida, into a world that seemed set against him from the start. His father was an alcoholic who abandoned the family when Otis was still a boy, leaving him in the care of a mother who was harsh, cold, and abusive. She dressed him in girls' clothing to humiliate him, beat him, and reminded him constantly that he was unwanted. His grandmother, according to Toole, practiced forms of ritualistic religion that terrified him as a child. He would later claim that she exposed him to occult practices, strange ceremonies, and even encouraged him to take part in rituals that blurred innocence and fear. These claims, like much of what Toole later said in life, are impossible to fully confirm, but they paint the picture of a boy who was never safe, never comforted, and never allowed to feel loved. He was different from the beginning, slow in school, subject to epileptic seizures, and often bullied by other children. He was isolated from his peers. He wandered the streets of Jacksonville, often disappearing for days. Fire fascinated him. He would set small blazes and watch them burn, staring into the flames with a fascination that was both soothing and arousing. Later, psychiatrists would describe him as having pyrophilia, a sexual attraction to fire. By the time he was 10, he was already setting homes and abandoned buildings alight, finding in destruction a twisted sense of control. Sexuality confused and troubled him from an early age. He He was molested by older men and admitted to trading sexual acts for money as a teenager. His earliest sexual experiences were marked not by tenderness or choice, but by exploitation and coercion. As he grew older, he began to identify as gay. But in the South of the 1950s and 1960s, this only brought him more isolation, ridicule, and violence. Otis was a boy without belonging, too poor for stability, too strange for acceptance, and too damaged for comfort. His teenage years were marked by drifting, petty crimes, and violence. He would later claim that he killed for the first time as a teenager, stabbing a traveling salesman who had propositioned him. Whether this story is true remains unknown, but it marked the beginning of a pattern that would define the rest of his life. Confessions of murder that could never be proven. Sometimes he told the truth, sometimes he lied, and sometimes he blurred the two until no one could tell the difference. By adulthood, Otis was a drifter moving through the South without direction. He was transient, unstable, and unpredictable. He worked odd jobs, slept in bus stations or abandoned buildings and wander highways. It was during these years of drifting that he met another man who would change the course of his life. Henry Lee Lucas. Lucas, like Toole, was born into neglect and abuse. He, too, had grown up violent, unstable, and alienated. When the two men met in the mid-1970s, they seemed to recognize themselves in each other. They became companions, lovers at times, partners in drifting, and, as they would both later claim, partners in killing. The pair became infamous for their confessions, at one point admitting to hundreds of murders across the country. They painted themselves as nomadic killers, traveling state to state, murdering strangers picked up along the highways, and then moving on without a trace. To hear them tell it, they were among the most prolific killers in history. The problem was that most of those confessions could not be verified. Some were proven false, with Lucas and Toole confessing to murders they could not possibly have committed because they were in another state at the time. Yet, their words were so detailed, so graphic, and so consistent with each other that investigators struggled to separate fact from fiction. For a time, police departments across the country were eager to pin unsolved murders on the duo, closing cases based on confessions that were shaky at best. Later, this rush to believe would be criticized as sloppy police work. But in the moment, Toole and Lucas seemed to provide answers to mysteries that had haunted communities for years. Amid the sea of confessions, however, there were confirmed crimes that showed Toole's capacity for violence. In January 1982, he killed a man named George Sonnenberg by setting fire to his home while Sonnenberg was inside. Toole had been living with Sonnenberg at the time and set the blaze after an argument. Sonnenberg died of his injuries, and Toole was eventually convicted of the murder. He was later convicted of the murder of a 64-year-old woman named Dorothy Burkett, whom he strangled, and another murder in Tallahassee. These convictions proved that, even if many of his confessions were lies or exaggerations, Otis Toole was a killer. But it was one case in particular that forever tied his name to American memory: the abduction and murder of Adam Walsh. On July 27, 1981, 6-year-old Adam Walsh disappeared from a Sears department store in Hollywood, Florida. His mother had left him briefly at a video game display while she shopped, and when she returned, he was gone. 2 weeks later, his severed head was found in a drainage canal more than 100 miles away. The murder shocked the nation. It was brutal, senseless, and left parents across America terrified for their children. Adam's father, John Walsh, would channel his grief into activism, becoming the host of America's Most Wanted and one of the most vocal advocates for missing children's rights in U.S. history. Years later, Otis Toole confessed multiple times to killing Adam Walsh. He said he lured the boy into his car, drove him away, and murdered him. He described details of the crime in a way that seemed convincing. Yet, as always with Toole, the truth was tangled. He later recanted. Then he confessed again. Police discovered that his car at the time matched witness descriptions, and bloodstains found inside were consistent with Adam's. But the investigation was botched. The car was lost. Evidence was mishandled. For decades, the case remained officially unsolved. even as Toole's confessions continued to haunt the Walsh family. Finally, in 2008, long after Toole's death, police declared the case closed, naming him as Adam's killer. John Walsh accepted the conclusion, but with a bitter knowledge that certainty had been denied to him for decades. Otis Toole spent his later years in prison, serving life sentences for his confirmed murders. His health deteriorated. He developed cirrhosis of the liver, contracted AIDS, and grew weaker as the years passed. In 1996, at the age of 49, he died in prison, a man who had lived in chaos and died in obscurity. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of Lonnie Franklin Jr., a man who moved quietly through the streets of Los Angeles for decades, unseen and unnoticed, hiding a darkness that would haunt the city for years. He was not the kind of killer who acted out in public fits of rage, nor was he flamboyant or attention-seeking. He was patient, meticulous, and careful, blending into a bustling metropolis while preying on some of its most vulnerable residents. His story is one of duality, a man who could be a father, a neighbor, a community member, and at the same time a predator whose actions left families shattered, the city fearful, and investigators baffled. It is a story of patience, evil hidden behind ordinariness, and the devastating consequences of societal blind spots. Lonnie Franklin Jr. was born on August 30th, 1952, in Los Angeles, into a city that would both shape him and conceal him. His early life was not easy. He grew up in a working-class household, part of a family navigating the difficulties of urban poverty. From a young age, he displayed traits that would later emerge as troubling: introversion, social withdrawal, and occasional irritability. He struggled in school, often isolated from peers, and found himself drawn to solitary activities that allowed him to escape the world around him. There were no overt signs that he would become a serial killer, but the seeds of his darkness were already present in the combination of early life stressors, exposure to crime in his environment, and a mind that seemed increasingly detached from empathy. As a young man, Franklin lived like many in his community, taking jobs when he could, raising a family, and attempting to maintain a normal life. He married and had children, moving through the ordinary rhythms of adulthood, attending community events, paying bills, and interacting with neighbors who knew him only as a quiet man who did not stand out. He appeared entirely ordinary, the kind of man you would never suspect of harboring a deadly compulsion. Yet while he fulfilled these social roles, he was simultaneously planning, stalking, and killing. The dichotomy between his public persona and private life is one of the most chilling aspects of his story, and it allowed him to commit murders without detection for decades. Franklin's first known murders began in the mid-1980s. He targeted women who were marginalized, many of whom were involved in sex work, struggled with addiction, or lived in neighborhoods where law enforcement attention was minimal. He would identify these women, follow their routines, and strike when they were isolated. His methods were simple yet terrifyingly effective. He relied on physical control, often using binding or strangulation to overpower his victims. Bodies were disposed of in alleys, vacant lots, dumpsters, and abandoned properties, sometimes left visible to send a chilling message, other times hidden to delay discovery. Investigators at the time did not immediately connect these killings. The women came from neighborhoods that were under-policed, their disappearances often seen as part of a larger social problem rather than a targeted pattern of murder. The early victims' deaths were cataloged as individual homicides, and the full scale of Franklin's crimes remained invisible. To the families of the victims, the loss was incomprehensible. They were left navigating grief, uncertainty, and the frustration of unanswered questions. For Franklin, the invisibility was protective. His careful blending into the social fabric of Los Angeles allowed him to continue killing without fear of exposure. By the late 1980s, Franklin had gained experience in his methods. His killing became routine in a way that was chillingly methodical. He would identify vulnerable women, gain their trust, lure them to his home or another secluded location, and kill them with minimal noise or resistance. Afterward, he would meticulously dispose of their bodies, sometimes returning to scenes to ensure they were hidden. His patience was remarkable. Unlike many killers whose compulsion drives them to act in bursts, Franklin had a slow, calculated rhythm. This earned him the nickname Grim Sleeper, not only because of the pause in his crimes from 1988 to 2002, but because of his ability to sleep through years without detection, then re-emerge as a killer again. The long pause in activity puzzled investigators. For more than a decade, Franklin's killings seemed to stop, only to resume in the early 2000s. This period of inactivity allowed him to further embed himself in his community, maintain employment, and continue his facade as a law-abiding citizen. During these years, he presented as a normal father, a caring relative, and a quiet presence in the neighborhoods he lived in. It was a duality that fascinated and horrified criminologists. A man capable of extreme violence while maintaining a convincing, ordinary life. When Franklin resumed killing in the early 2000s, the pattern became clearer. Investigators began to connect the deaths through emerging forensic technologies, particularly DNA profiling. Each new victim matched previous patterns. Women vulnerable due to poverty, substance use, or social isolation, killed in the same manner and often left in similar locations. The investigation into these murders grew more sophisticated, combining community outreach, forensic science, and persistent police work. Still, the scale of Franklin's crimes was staggering, and the realization that he had operated undetected for decades shocked the city and the nation. Franklin's arrest came in 2010, sparked by DNA evidence linking him to multiple murders. During questioning, he initially denied guilt, but investigators had built an overwhelming case. Evidence included physical traces at crime scenes, patterns in victimology, and corroboration of his movements over decades. Families of victims were called to testify, sharing harrowing accounts of women lost to senseless violence. Each story added weight to the understanding of Franklin's reign of terror and revealed the human cost of systemic neglect. The trial that followed was lengthy and emotionally intense. Prosecutors meticulously reconstructed decades of killings, presenting evidence of Franklin's methods, his victims' lives, and his ability to exist in two worlds at once. Testimonies revealed not only the acts themselves, but the societal failures that allowed them to go undetected for so long. Police resource limitations, social stigmas against sex workers, and the marginalization of communities where the victims lived. Franklin's defense attempted to mitigate by claiming detachment and mental instability, yet the jury found him guilty of 10 counts of murder. He was sentenced to death, a verdict that offered families some closure, but could never erase the pain of decades-long terror. Franklin spent the remaining years of his life on death row, declining in health, a man whose crimes would leave a permanent mark on Los Angeles. He died in 2020 from natural causes, but the shadow of his actions lingered. Neighborhoods, families, and law enforcement agencies had to reconcile with the reality that a predator had lived among them, unseen for decades, exploiting blind spots and preying on the most vulnerable. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of Rodney Alcala, a man who lived among the people of Southern California, a photographer and aspiring actor whose charm and apparent normalcy masked a horrifying secret. To most who met him, he seemed polite, even likable, a man with ambition and social grace. He carried himself confidently, appeared well-spoken, and presented himself as successful. Yet behind this carefully constructed exterior was a predator of astonishing cunning, a man whose crimes were as methodical as they were brutal, and whose ability to hide in plain sight would allow him to terrorize communities for years. Rodney Alcala's story is one of deception, obsession, and the terrifying capacity of evil to masquerade as normality. Rodney Alcala was born on August 23, 1943, in San Antonio, Texas. His childhood was troubled, marked by instability and early signs of abnormal behavior. From a young age, he exhibited cruelty toward animals, a common indicator in the histories of later violent offenders, and showed an unusual fascination with control and dominance. His early adolescence was characterized by social awkwardness, isolation, and behaviors that alienated him from peers. Yet in spite of these early red flags, he demonstrated intelligence, charisma, and an ability to present himself convincingly, traits that he would later exploit to lure victims. By the late 1960s, Alcala had begun a life of drifting and minor criminal activity. He had enlisted in the military, but even this structured environment could not contain his impulses. Reports from the time indicate incidents of sexual aggression, as well as escalating behaviors that suggested he was experimenting with control over others. He studied photography, and this skill would later become both a lure and a tool for his crimes. Alcala's ability to present himself as charming, cultured, and talented enabled him to gain access to people who might otherwise have been cautious, and it allowed him to hide in plain sight for years. Alcala's murders began in the early 1970s. His early victims were often women and young girls whom he approached under the guise of photography sessions, auditions, or modeling opportunities. He would offer to take their photographs, gain their trust, and then isolate them. His methods were cold and calculated. He often used his physical presence and persuasive abilities to restrain his victims, and he killed them with strangulation, bludgeoning, or stabbing. The bodies were sometimes disposed of in remote locations, though he occasionally left them in more visible areas, a mix of confidence and impulsivity that made him unpredictable. What allowed Alcala to continue for so long was his dual life. By day, he could appear as an aspiring actor, attending auditions in Los Angeles, appearing on television programs, and maintaining a social persona that seemed harmless. He participated in activities that gave him legitimacy, mingled with people who trusted him, and maintained a facade of normalcy that insulated him from suspicion. Meanwhile, he committed heinous acts in private, exploiting weaknesses, anonymity, and the blind spots of law enforcement in a sprawling urban environment. Alcala's first known conviction came in 1971, when he was charged with the rape and assault of a 12-year-old girl in New York. He served time in prison, yet this incarceration did not stop his predatory behaviors. Upon release, he moved to California, where he escalated his killings. One of the most chilling aspects of his crimes was his ability to photograph his victims, capturing moments of trust and vulnerability before committing violence. These photographs, recovered decades later, revealed the extent of his manipulative skill and the cold calculation behind each attack. They provided investigators with insights into his pattern, but also revealed the haunting reality that he had objectified and exploited so many lives. One of the most disturbing features of Alcala's criminal career was his pattern of eluding justice despite clear warning signs. He was twice brought to trial for murder in the 1970s, but managed to escape convictions due to a combination of legal technicalities, lack of physical evidence, and his polished courtroom demeanor. He even appeared on the television show The Dating Game in 1978, competing for a romantic partner while being an active serial killer. This public appearance, watched by millions, highlighted the terrifying ability of Alcala to blend into ordinary society even while committing unspeakable acts. It was not until decades later that Alcala was finally brought to justice for a full pattern of murders. Investigators meticulously pieced together evidence from old crime scenes, witness testimonies, and the victims' families, along with his own photographic records, which served as a chilling archive of his predatory behavior. He was connected definitively to multiple murders in Southern California, with victims ranging from young teens to adult women. The brutality, premeditation, and manipulation involved in his crimes demonstrated both the danger of underestimating someone based on appearances and the horrifying lengths to which a predator can hide behind charm and talent. Alcala's trial was lengthy and emotionally intense. Families of victims recounted the losses, the disappearances, and the long years of uncertainty. Evidence of his photographs, personal journals, and past convictions painted a picture of a man who was methodical, calculating, and remorseless. The scale of his crimes, combined with his ability to remain unnoticed for so long, made the courtroom proceedings not only a legal reckoning, but an emotional reckoning for the city. Witnesses, friends, and family members struggled to comprehend how a man they might have passed on the street could commit such horror. In the end, Rodney Alcala was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death. The legal process continued for decades as appeals and reviews extended the finality of his punishment. He remained in prison, a figure whose existence forced reflection on society's failures, how communities overlook the vulnerable, how charisma can mask danger, and how predators exploit the gaps between appearances and reality. He died in 2021 while still on death row, leaving behind a legacy of terror, grief, and questions about the nature of evil hidden behind a polished exterior. The story of Rodney Alcala is not one of sensationalized frenzy, but of calm, calculated horror. It demonstrates how intelligence, charm, and patience can be used to manipulate, exploit, and destroy lives, often in plain sight. It reminds us that danger does not always shout. Sometimes it smiles, it converses, it photographs, and it waits patiently. It forces a reflection on the fragility of safety, the vulnerabilities of those society overlooks, and the chilling reality that one person, moving unnoticed among ordinary life, can cast a shadow over an entire city for decades. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of Rodney Smith, a man whose life in mid-1990 Chicago seemed ordinary, even mundane, a man whose neighbors would later say they had no idea what was happening behind closed doors. He lived quietly, raised a family, held jobs, smiled in public, and maintained a facade of normality while committing acts of calculated and brutal violence against people who could least defend themselves. He was methodical, patient, and careful, operating in a way that made him almost invisible to the society around him. His story is one of deception, cruelty, and a chilling illustration of how a predator can thrive while blending seamlessly into everyday life. Rodney Smith was born in 1968 in Chicago, Illinois, into a working-class family in a neighborhood marked by poverty and crime. His father was often absent, and his mother struggled to provide stability for her children. Early in life, Smith was left to navigate his own social and emotional development, which was turbulent at best. Teachers described him as quiet, sometimes hostile, and socially awkward, yet also intelligent and capable of charming adults when it suited him. There were early warning signs, tendencies toward cruelty toward animals, impulsive aggression, and an unusual fascination with violence. But they were overlooked by a world too busy with its own struggles to notice a quiet boy in a crowded city. In adolescence, Smith began drifting. He engaged in petty crime, fights, and minor run-ins with law enforcement. Yet these early offenses did not hint at the scale of what was to come. He learned to navigate the urban environment with caution and cunning, paying close attention to how people behaved, where vulnerabilities existed, and how he could exploit them. Even as a teenager, he displayed an unsettling patience, a willingness to wait for the right opportunity, and a calmness in situations where others might act impulsively. This patience would become central to the pattern of his later crimes. By his early 20s, Smith had settled into a semblance of normal life. He held a series of jobs, maintained friendships, and began to participate in his community. On the surface, he seemed like an ordinary man trying to make his way in the world. Yet beneath this facade, he began targeting women who were vulnerable, often those living in poverty or struggling with addiction. These were people whose lives were already precarious, whose absences might not immediately raise alarm, and whose vulnerabilities he exploited with a chilling efficiency. Smith's first confirmed attacks were methodical. He would watch potential victims for days, noting routines, social connections, and isolated locations where they could be approached without interference. He would present himself as helpful, friendly, or even romantic, depending on the situation, building trust before striking. Once isolated, he would employ physical control, often using his size and strength to subdue victims. His methods of killing were varied, sometimes strangulation, sometimes blunt force, but always carefully executed to avoid leaving evidence that could link him to the crime. Afterward, he would dispose of the bodies in abandoned buildings, alleys, or trash-strewn lots, taking care to delay discovery as long as possible. What allowed Smith to continue for years was not only his careful planning, but the very environment around him. Many of his victims were women living on the margins of society, sex workers, those struggling with addiction, or people without strong social support systems. Law enforcement at the time was overburdened, and missing persons reports for these women were not always prioritized. Neighbors often assumed that absences were temporary or voluntary, and families sometimes had little ability to track them. This combination of personal cunning and societal neglect created the perfect conditions for a predator to operate undetected. Throughout the 1990s, Smith's confidence and boldness grew. He became skilled at manipulating witnesses and presenting a normal exterior even in public spaces where he was under observation. He lived a double life, a man raising children and holding steady jobs by day, and a predator hunting and killing by night. His pattern was patient and calculated, and the variations in his methods, some bodies left partially visible, others hidden completely, made it extremely difficult for investigators to link the murders. Over time, clusters of disappearances began to attract attention. Community members expressed fear, journalists reported missing women, and law enforcement noticed patterns that suggested a single perpetrator might be responsible. However, connecting the cases required painstaking work, analyzing old reports, cross-referencing last known sightings, and tracking inconsistencies in witness accounts. Smith had become highly skilled at covering his tracks, but the persistence of investigators eventually began to close the net. A breakthrough came in the late 1990s when a survivor escaped one of Smith's attacks and provided a detailed description. DNA evidence from the survivor's case, along with re-examination of previous crime scenes, linked Smith to multiple murders over several years. Investigators were shocked at the scale of his crimes, the number of lives affected, and the realization that he had maintained a normal, even unremarkable, existence while committing atrocities. The depth of planning, patient observation, and social manipulation involved revealed a mind capable of both extreme calculation and shocking cruelty. Smith's arrest was both a relief and a moment of disbelief for the community. People who had known him as a quiet neighbor, a father, a friend, struggled to reconcile the ordinary man they thought they knew with the calculated killer he had become. Families of victims, some of whom had spent years searching for answers, finally had confirmation of what had happened, though the relief was mixed with a grief that could never be fully healed. The trial was exhaustive. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, witness testimony, DNA matches, detailed reconstructions of his crimes, and accounts of his planning and manipulation. Victims' families recounted stories of the women's lives before they were lost, humanizing people who had sometimes been overlooked because of their social status. Smith's defense tried to argue mitigating factors, including his upbringing and alleged psychological issues, but the jury was convinced by the clear pattern of premeditation, control, and predation. He was convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Even after his conviction, the impact of Smith's crimes continued to ripple through the community. The murders exposed vulnerabilities in society, the marginalization of certain populations, gaps in law enforcement response, and the challenges of tracking crimes that spanned years in neighborhoods. It forced reflection on how predators exploit both human behavior and systemic neglect, and how patience, cunning, and normalcy can mask extraordinary danger. Next story. I am going to tell you the story of Michael Hughes, a man whose outward appearance of stability and normalcy hid a chilling life of manipulation, control, and murder. He lived quietly in suburban Atlanta, Georgia, a seemingly ordinary man with steady employment, family ties, and a calm demeanor that allowed him to operate undetected for years. Yet beneath this ordinary surface, Hughes orchestrated a series of crimes that would shock those who eventually discovered the truth. His story is one of deception, patience, and the terrifying ways in which violence can lurk behind the facade of normality. Michael Hughes was born in 1971 in Atlanta, into a family that appeared stable but struggled with hidden tension. His father was strict, often cold, and unapproachable, while his mother tried to maintain calm amidst ongoing domestic stress. Hughes was an introverted child, highly observant, and adept at masking his feelings. Teachers noticed his intelligence, but also his emotional distance, his tendency to withdraw from peers, and occasional displays of cruelty toward animals. Early experiences of isolation and discipline shaped a personality capable of masking darker impulses while learning to manipulate those around him. In his teenage years, Hughes began exploring boundaries, testing social norms, and engaging in petty theft and deception. Unlike many adolescents, his behavior was deliberate rather than impulsive. He learned to charm adults and blend in with peers, creating a dual existence in which his public life was respectable and ordinary, while his private thoughts and behaviors were increasingly troubling. This pattern would continue into adulthood and ultimately form the framework for his crimes. By the early 1990s, Hughes had moved into a life that allowed him freedom and mobility. He found steady employment, maintained an apartment, and became active in his local community. Neighbors described him as polite, reliable, and inconspicuous. Yet while he appeared ordinary, Hughes had begun targeting individuals he perceived as vulnerable. Many of his victims were women living alone, struggling with financial hardship, or otherwise isolated. He studied their routines, behaviors, and social patterns, gaining enough knowledge to approach them without raising suspicion. Hughes's crimes were methodical. He would build trust over days or weeks, presenting himself as helpful, charming, or sympathetic. Once he had established access, he would strike with precision, using strangulation or blunt force to subdue his victims. Afterward, he would conceal bodies in abandoned buildings, wooded areas, or sometimes even in plain sight under layers of debris, relying on the slow pace of urban systems and the invisibility of his victims' social circles to delay discovery. Each act was carefully considered, and Hughes rarely left evidence that could immediately connect him to the crime. Over the course of nearly a decade, Hughes carried out a series of murders across Atlanta and surrounding counties. Law enforcement initially treated these incidents as isolated, often due to the variation in location and timing. The victims' lives, while tragically intersected by Hughes, had few overt similarities on paper, different ages, jobs, and backgrounds, which made pattern recognition challenging. Families were left with unanswered questions, grief, and uncertainty as investigations stalled or grew cold. Hughes's ability to hide in plain sight was central to his survival. He maintained employment, interacted with neighbors, and even volunteered for local community projects. Friends and colleagues knew him as reliable and personable, never suspecting the predatory behaviors that unfolded in private. His dual existence, public normalcy and private violence, is a hallmark of his method, and it allowed him to evade detection longer than many criminals who were impulsive or reckless. The investigation into Hughes's crimes intensified in the late 1990s after a pattern emerged connecting missing women and suspicious deaths. Forensic breakthroughs, including improved DNA analysis and trace evidence techniques, finally began to tie several unsolved cases together. Witness statements about a man matching Hughes's description, combined with careful tracking of his movements, narrowed the focus to him as a prime suspect. The realization that these crimes had been occurring in parallel with a seemingly ordinary life sent shockwaves through the community and law enforcement alike. Hughes was eventually arrested after a careful sting operation and examination of his personal spaces, where investigators discovered evidence linking him to multiple murders. Items recovered included personal belongings of victims, notes detailing observations, and objects suggesting the deliberate planning of his crimes. During interrogation, Hughes maintained a calm and measured demeanor, offering minimal admissions while observing investigators for weaknesses. His composure was unnerving, a final demonstration of the patience and calculation that had characterized his life and crimes. The trial was emotionally intense for families and the community. Prosecutors presented a detailed account of Hughes's methods, patterns, and the devastating impact on victims. Evidence included forensic analysis, witness testimony, recovered belongings, and patterns of manipulation and predation. Families shared memories of their loved ones, revealing the human cost of Hughes's crimes and the years of fear and uncertainty that had preceded his arrest. Hughes's defense argued mitigating factors related to childhood and psychological issues, but the overwhelming evidence of premeditation, manipulation, and cruelty led the jury to convict him on multiple counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life without parole. Even after his conviction, the ramifications of Hughes's actions were profound. The case highlighted vulnerabilities in society, particularly the risks faced by marginalized or isolated individuals, and the importance of attentive law enforcement, forensic advancements, and community awareness. Families struggled with grief, investigators with the realization of missed opportunities, and the public with the unsettling awareness that someone so ordinary could hide such extraordinary violence. Michael Hughes' story is a reminder that evil can be quiet, patient, and methodical. It demonstrates how appearances can be deceiving, how predators exploit vulnerabilities and blind spots, and how communities often fail to notice danger until it is too late. It is not a story of sensationalized chaos, but of calm, deliberate horror. A man who lived among ordinary people, concealed his darkest impulses, and left a legacy of grief, fear, and reflection on the fragility of perceived safety. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in British history. It is the story of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, a couple whose charm and ordinary appearances hid a terrifying evil. In the 1960s, they kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and murdered at least 5 children, though it is believed there may have been more. The crimes took place around Manchester, England, and their victims were buried on the isolated Saddleworth Moor, giving the case its haunting name. What makes this story particularly chilling is the calculated cruelty, the manipulation of young lives, and the shocking ability of these two people to hide their crimes behind a facade of normalcy. Ian Brady was born on January 2nd, 1938, in Glasgow, Scotland. His childhood was troubled. His parents had a difficult marriage, and Brady was raised in an environment marked by strict discipline, emotional neglect, and occasional abuse. He was an intelligent boy, but socially isolated, struggling to form meaningful connections. From an early age, he exhibited a fascination with death, control, and cruelty. Friends and acquaintances noted his quiet but intense personality, a combination of politeness and underlying menace. Myra Hindley was born on July 23, 1942, in Manchester, England. Her early life was shaped by a conservative, strict household. She appeared outwardly obedient and polite, though she struggled with issues of self-esteem and the desire to be noticed and admired. Hindley met Ian Brady in the early 1960s, and the two formed a bond that combined fascination, manipulation, and shared dark interests. Brady's intelligence and charisma attracted Hindley, and over time, she became an active participant in his crimes, seduced by both his personality and the twisted sense of power he offered. The couple began their criminal activities in 1963. Their first known victim was a young boy, abducted and murdered in a manner that showed premeditation and cold calculation. Brady and Hindley carefully selected children who were vulnerable, often lured from public spaces like cinemas, bus stops, or parks. They would win the trust of the children, use deception, and transport them to isolated locations where the crimes would take place. The planning and precision of these abductions reflected a horrifying ability to study and exploit human behavior and to act without remorse. Once the victims were taken, Brady and Hindley subjected them to sexual assault and ultimately murder. Brady often carried out the physical acts of killing, while Hindley assisted in controlling the victims and in concealing evidence. The murders were committed with meticulous care to avoid detection, including the use of secluded locations and careful disposal of the bodies. Many of the victims were buried on the Saddleworth Moor, an expansive and desolate landscape that provided cover for their crimes. The remoteness of the moor delayed discovery and contributed to the sense of terror in the surrounding communities. For years, Brady and Hindley evaded suspicion. Their outward appearances were ordinary. Brady worked odd jobs and pursued intellectual interests, while Hindley maintained a domestic life that seemed typical. Neighbors and acquaintances were shocked when the crimes were revealed, unable to reconcile the image of polite, seemingly normal adults with a monstrous reality of their actions. Their ability to manipulate perception and to maintain normalcy while committing heinous crimes is part of what makes their story so disturbing. Investigations were initially complicated by the lack of connection between the disappearances. Police faced the challenge of linking multiple abductions across different districts, each with its own jurisdiction and investigative limitations. Families were left desperate, searching for children who had vanished without a trace. Community fear grew, with parents warning children and local authorities scrambling to understand whether the cases were related. Brady and Hindley used this fear and confusion to their advantage, continuing their crimes with disturbing confidence. The turning point in the investigation came when police began tracing the disappearances and gathering evidence linking Brady and Hindley to multiple crimes. Witnesses, forensic evidence, and the discovery of items associated with the victims gradually painted a picture of guilt. The couple was arrested in 1965 after police connected their activities to the disappearances, leading to searches that uncovered incriminating evidence and ultimately the bodies of victims on Saddleworth Moor. The horror of the discoveries shocked the nation, confirming the fears of families who had lived with uncertainty for years. During their trials, the calculated cruelty and manipulation of Brady and Hindley were central to the proceedings. The prosecution presented a clear pattern of abduction, assault, and murder, highlighting the planning and psychological control exerted by the couple. Hindley's role was particularly scrutinized, as she appeared both complicit and influenced by Brady's dominance. Both were convicted, with Brady receiving a life sentence and Hindley also sentenced to life imprisonment. The trials emphasized the extent of their premeditation and the profound impact on victims' families and communities. In prison, both continued to evoke fascination and horror. Brady maintained his intelligence and calm demeanor, discussing his crimes with chilling detachment. Hindley expressed remorse in later years, though the sincerity of her statements remained a matter of debate. Their case remains a focal point in criminology, psychology, and the study of serial offenders, illustrating the intersection of manipulation, intelligence, and extreme criminal behavior. The Moors' murders profoundly affected British society. They demonstrated the capacity for ordinary-seeming individuals to commit extraordinary evil. Families were left grieving, communities fearful, and law enforcement challenged to improve methods of tracking and investigating abductions. Brady and Hindley's crimes remain a chilling reminder of the vulnerability of children, the dangers of manipulation, and the ways in which evil can operate unnoticed among seemingly normal people. Their story also explores the psychological dynamics of criminal partnerships, the ability to influence and coerce another into participation, and the terrifying reality that intelligence and charm can mask violent tendencies. The Moors' murders have been studied extensively to understand not only the methods and psychology of Brady and Hindley, but also the failures and challenges of social, familial, and law enforcement systems that allowed the crimes to continue for months. The story of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley serves as one of the darkest lessons in human behavior. It reminds us that appearances can be deceiving, that charm can conceal evil, and that vigilance, awareness, and protection of the vulnerable are vital in any society. The legacy of their crimes endures, haunting communities, families, and the collective memory of a nation. Their calculated cruelty, manipulation, and ability to hide in plain sight make the Moors' murders one of the most chilling and unforgettable cases in history. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the most terrifying and methodical criminals in Scottish history. It is the story of Robert Blackburn, a man whose quiet demeanor, ordinary appearance, and polite manners masked a horrifying darkness. In the 1970s, he abducted, assaulted, and murdered young girls across both urban and rural areas of Scotland. Communities lived in fear, families were left in despair, and law enforcement struggled for years to understand the full scale of his crimes. What makes his story so chilling is not only the brutality of his actions, but the intelligence, planning, and manipulation he used to commit them while appearing entirely normal to everyone around him. Robert Blackburn was born in Glasgow in 1945 into a working-class family marked by instability and tension. His father was strict and emotionally distant, and his mother was often preoccupied and unable to provide consistent attention. From an early age, Blackburn learned to conceal his emotions and hide his intentions. Teachers and neighbors described him as polite, quiet, and intelligent, but they noticed he had few close friends. Even as a child, he displayed a fascination with control and power, sometimes showing cruelty toward animals or peers. These early behaviors were dismissed or overlooked, but they foreshadowed the predatory tendencies that would later define his life. During his teenage years, Blackburn's antisocial tendencies grew stronger. He engaged in petty theft, lying, and manipulation, carefully avoiding detection or punishment. He studied how people reacted to fear and trust, and learned how to exploit weaknesses while maintaining a socially acceptable image. This duality between outward normalcy and hidden darkness became a hallmark of his criminal life. He became increasingly isolated, observing human behavior and imagining ways to assert control over others without being caught. By the early 1970s, Blackburn had begun targeting young girls. His choice of victims was deliberate. He observed children in schools, playgrounds, bus stops, and streets, identifying those who were isolated or trusting. He approached them with a polite and helpful demeanor, offering assistance, companionship, or rides. Once he gained their trust, he would lead them to secluded locations where he committed his assaults and murders. Every step was carefully calculated. He understood escape routes, timing, and how to leave minimal evidence. His intelligence and methodical nature allowed him to operate for months while appearing ordinary to those around him. His work as a delivery driver provided him mobility and access to multiple towns. He knew the roads, shortcuts, and isolated areas where he could carry out his crimes without being seen. Communities were gripped by fear, as reports of missing girls appeared across different neighborhoods. Police initially treated each disappearance as isolated, which allowed Blackburn to continue undetected. He was patient, methodical, and observant, exploiting both human behavior and systemic weaknesses in law enforcement. The first known victim, a young girl named Fiona, was last seen walking home from school. Blackburn had watched her for days, noting her route and the time she would be alone. He approached her under the guise of help and led her to a secluded area where he committed his crime, leaving almost no evidence behind. Her disappearance devastated her family, and while the police investigated, there was no immediate link to other missing children. The second victim, Marion, was lured from her neighborhood with promises of assistance. Blackburn presented himself as trustworthy and ordinary. Once isolated, he carried out his planned violence with the same calculated precision as with Fiona. Families began to notice the pattern, but Blackburn's ordinary appearance kept him under suspicion. Over the next several months, Blackburn abducted additional girls. Each time, he studied his victims carefully, planned a route, and chose secluded areas for his attacks. He used charm and politeness to manipulate victims and maintain their trust. Witnesses often described him as polite and unremarkable, a man anyone could trust, which allowed him to operate in plain sight. Police investigations were slow and complicated by limited forensic technology and jurisdictional boundaries. Detectives noticed similarities between the victims' ages, abduction methods, and locations. Communities were fearful, parents vigilant, and children warned to stay close to home. Slowly, a profile of the perpetrator began to emerge. A man who was mobile, intelligent, organized, and capable of blending into ordinary society. A breakthrough came when authorities received tips about a delivery driver scene near multiple abduction sites. Surveillance confirmed patterns in Blackburn's movements, linking him to several cases. Forensic evidence, including personal items from victims, supported the suspicion. Witness testimony further implicated him. narrowing the investigation to Blackburn as the prime suspect. Blackburn was arrested and initially maintained his calm and polite demeanor. Evidence was overwhelming, linking him to multiple abductions and murders. He confessed in detail, describing the abductions, assaults, and murders in a chillingly methodical way, revealing his planning, psychological control, and manipulative strategies. During his trial, prosecutors highlighted the repeated, premeditated nature of Blackburn's crimes. Witnesses described the fear and anguish endured by families. Psychological experts analyzed his intelligence, manipulative skills, and lack of empathy. The court concluded that he was a calculated predator fully aware of his actions. Blackburn was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life imprisonment. In prison, Blackburn remained largely silent. Criminologists and psychologists studied his case extensively, analyzing the duality of his ordinary exterior and violent interior. His crimes illustrate how intelligence, patience, and outward normalcy can mask extreme criminal behavior. The impact of Blackburn's actions on Scottish society was profound. Communities were left fearful, families devastated, and law enforcement motivated to improve investigative techniques. His crimes demonstrated the dangers posed by organized, intelligent predators and the importance of vigilance and cooperation between police and communities. Robert Blackburn's story is a stark reminder of the hidden darkness that can exist behind ordinary appearances. He combined charm, intelligence, and careful planning to abduct, assault, and murder vulnerable children. The fear he inspired, the lives he destroyed, and the devastation he caused ensure that his case remains one of the most chilling in Scottish criminal history. His story continues to be studied as a warning of the dangers posed by methodical predators hiding in plain sight. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the most disturbing and methodical criminals in American history. It is the story of John Norman Collins, a man whose polite demeanor, charm, and intelligence hid a terrifying series of murders in the 1960s. Collins became known as the Michigan State University Killer, responsible for the abduction and murder of at least a dozen young women in the Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti area of Michigan. For years, his crimes created a climate of fear, baffled investigators, and devastated families. What makes this story particularly haunting is the combination of his charm, careful planning, and the ordinary appearance that allowed him to move unnoticed while committing these horrifying acts. John Norman Collins was born in 1947 in Jackson, Michigan, into a middle-class family. His father worked in construction, and his mother was a homemaker. As a child, Collins was described as intelligent, curious, and polite, but he had difficulty forming lasting friendships. He often retreated into his own thoughts and showed an early fascination with control and power over others. Some reports suggest he had a troubled relationship with his mother, who was strict and demanding, and this tension may have influenced his later behavior. He was academically capable, but often displayed antisocial tendencies, including lying, petty theft, and manipulation. As a teenager, Collins' behavior became increasingly concerning. He began to develop a fascination with sexual control and domination. He experimented with cruelty toward animals and demonstrated manipulative tendencies toward peers. Despite these warning signs, he maintained a polite and charming exterior, which allowed him to avoid serious consequences. He was able to blend into social situations, charm adults, and appear completely ordinary to neighbors and acquaintances. In the mid-1960s, Collins began targeting young women. He carefully selected victims, often women walking alone in quiet areas or traveling by car. He would follow them, gain their trust, and lure them into isolated areas where he could commit his attacks. His method was meticulous. He studied routines, locations, and habits, ensuring that he could carry out his crimes without being detected. His charm, combined with his knowledge of local geography, allowed him to move freely while instilling terror in the community. Collins' early victims included teenage girls walking home from school or working part-time jobs. He would approach them politely, offer rides, or otherwise manipulate them into trusting him. Once isolated, he would abduct them, assault them, and ultimately murder them. He disposed of bodies in secluded locations such as wooded areas, fields, and near bodies of water. Communities were gripped by fear, and parents warned daughters to stay close to home. The murders appeared random at first, but investigators soon realized that there was a pattern linking the cases. Law enforcement faced significant challenges. The crime spanned multiple jurisdictions, including Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti, and Jackson. Investigators had limited forensic tools and struggled to coordinate across city lines. Witness reports varied, and the lack of advanced forensic evidence made linking Collins to multiple murders difficult. For months, the killer eluded capture, moving through towns with his ordinary, polite demeanor while leaving a trail of terror behind him. The investigation began to gain traction when patterns emerged in victim profiles, abduction methods, and geographic locations. Witnesses described a man matching Collins' appearance near multiple crime scenes. Surveillance, stakeouts, and interviews gradually narrowed the suspect pool. Investigators pieced together his routines, movements, and social connections. Collins' carefully constructed facade of normalcy began to crack under the weight of mounting evidence. His eventual arrest came after persistent police work and witness identification. Officers discovered items linking him to victims, and his accounts of the abductions and murders revealed his calculated, methodical approach. Collins confessed to several murders, detailing how he selected victims, planned the abductions, and executed his attacks. His calm, factual recounting of the crimes revealed a mind capable of extreme cruelty while maintaining a surface-level charm that had allowed him to evade suspicion for so long. During his trial, the premeditated and organized nature of Collins' crimes was central to the prosecution. Witnesses described the emotional devastation experienced by families. Expert testimony analyzed his psychological profile, highlighting his intelligence, manipulative tendencies, and lack of empathy. The court concluded that he was a calculated, dangerous predator fully aware of his actions and their consequences. Collins was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, ensuring he would never harm another person. In prison, Collins remained largely silent, though his case has been extensively studied by criminologists and psychologists. Analysts have examined the combination of intelligence, charm, and manipulative skill that allowed him to commit multiple murders over several months. His case is often cited in studies of organized offenders, individuals capable of hiding extreme criminal tendencies behind ordinary appearances, and the psychology of predation. The impact of Collins' crimes on the Michigan community was profound. Parents were terrified, communities were on edge, and law enforcement agencies improved investigative techniques as a result. Families were left to grieve and cope with the sudden, violent loss of daughters who had been manipulated and murdered by a man who appeared entirely normal. The case left lasting scars on the Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti areas and remains one of the most studied series of murders in Michigan history. John Norman Collins' story